She had hired 9 bodyguards to protect her daughter, 9 trained professionals, 9 men with credentials, references, and combat experience. 9 different faces that made a 7-year-old girl press herself against the wall and whisper, "Please don't make him stay." Sabrina Westcott had built a billion-dollar aerospace company from the ground up. She had stared down hostile takeovers, survived a public divorce, and negotiated contracts that made men twice her age sweat through their collars. But she could not make her daughter feel safe. Then came number 10, and the moment Maisie Westcott looked at him, this quiet, unremarkable man standing in the marble foyer with his hands loose at his sides, she didn't retreat. She didn't cry. She leaned up and pressed her lips to her mother's ear and said the 7 words that changed everything. "Mom, I know him, and I really like him." Sabrina went still. She had never seen this man before in her life. So how did her daughter know him? If this is your first time here, welcome. And please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a story. Hit the like button if you want to see more, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now stay with me, because this one goes somewhere you will not expect. The morning it started, Sabrina was already 40 minutes behind. That was unusual. She ran her schedule the way she ran her company, with enough margin built in that small disasters couldn't metastasize into large ones. But her 6:30 call with the Singapore procurement team had stretched past 8, and then her CFO had appeared in her doorway with the kind of expression that meant the problem couldn't wait. And by the time she'd handled both, the household had already shifted into its own particular brand of chaos without her. She found Maisie at the breakfast table, still in her pajamas at 8:47, eating cereal with one hand and holding a book about deep-sea fish with the other. The nanny, Rosa, was somewhere near the back of the house arguing quietly with the kitchen contractor about a cabinet that still hadn't been rehung after 3 weeks. The previous night's security report sat unopened on the counter. Sabrina poured herself coffee that had gone lukewarm and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the back lawn. The security post at the far edge of the property was empty. Again. She set down the mug. "Rosa." Her voice was controlled, but Rosa appeared in the doorway within 4 seconds, which meant she'd heard the tone. "Mr. Hendricks called in sick," Rosa said, before Sabrina could ask. "He left a voicemail at 6. I thought you'd seen it." "I hadn't." "I'm sorry, Ms. Westcott. I tried to reach the agency." "Don't." Sabrina held up one hand. "It's not your job to reach the agency. That's the point." She didn't say anything else. She finished the coffee, cold as it was, and went back upstairs to make the call herself. That was the 9th. Not the 9th sick day, though there had been enough of those. The 9th bodyguard in 14 months who had, in one way or another, failed to be the thing she actually needed: consistent, calm, and capable of making her daughter feel like the world wasn't a threat. 3 had quit because Maisie was difficult around them. 1 had lasted exactly 6 days before he'd raised his voice at a paparazzo outside Maisie's school, and Sabrina had let him go the same afternoon. 2 had come with excellent references and turned out to have serious personal issues that disqualified them entirely. 1 had treated the job like a temporary assignment, which, she supposed, it had been. 1 had tried, genuinely, but Maisie's fear of strangers was bad enough that she'd started having nightmares again within a week of his arrival. And Sabrina had made the call. And now Hendricks, who had seemed solid, had apparently decided that a sick day without real notice was acceptable. She sat on the edge of her bed and called her head of security. Marcus Hale picked up on the second ring, which he always did. 14 years with the company, the last 4 as head of the division. He was careful, methodical, and thorough in the way that people who'd spent long careers in risk management tended to be. Sabrina trusted him the way she trusted the structural reports on her buildings, completely, because she'd never had reason not to. "I know," he said before she spoke. "I've already been in contact with the agency." 9, Marcus. A pause. "I know. I need someone different, not from the same pool. Whoever they've been sending me has been wrong, and I'm starting to think the problem is with the source, not the individuals." "I've been thinking the same thing." He sounded like he'd been awake for a while. "I have someone. He's not agency, former military, elite background, though he's deliberately kept a low profile since leaving service. He's been doing independent security consulting for the last 4 years. Solid record, no incidents, spotless references. I've worked with him once before on a lower profile assignment, and he was exactly what he said he was. How old? 37, single father. He has an 8-year-old boy. Sabrina didn't respond immediately. I know you've had concerns about live-in arrangements, Marcus said carefully. The concern isn't live-in. The concern is that every person I've brought into this house has made Maisie feel like a prisoner in it. She looked at the door, which was open, and could hear Maisie downstairs asking Rosa something about whether anglerfish could survive in swimming pools. She's 7. She's already anxious. I don't need someone who treats the property like a military installation and terrifies my daughter in the process. He doesn't operate that way. That's why I thought of him. Name? Callum Reeve. She wrote it down. Send me everything you have. I'll review it tonight and we'll set something up for Thursday. I'll reach out to him today. She hung up and sat for another moment in the quiet. From downstairs, she heard Maisie laugh at something, a real laugh, clear and sudden, and the tightness in Sabrina's chest loosened just slightly. She picked up the phone again and rescheduled her 9:30. Thursday came gray and cold, the kind of late October morning where the light never really arrived. Sabrina had read Callum Reeve's file twice the night before, and once again over breakfast while Maisie ate toast and complained that her school was doing a fire drill that afternoon, and fire drills were the worst thing ever invented. Worse than mosquitoes? Sabrina said, not looking up from the file. Maisie considered this with great seriousness. About the same. The file was thorough, if deliberately sparse in certain areas. Military service was listed with a gap that suggested something more classified than standard infantry. She'd seen that pattern before. Contractors and private security professionals who'd held clearances didn't always advertise what they'd done, and reputable ones didn't lie about it either. They simply declined to specify. 4 years of independent work since leaving the service. 2 long-term private family assignments, both of which had ended because the families relocated internationally. 3 references, all of whom Marcus had called personally and reported back were, in his word, emphatic. One detail she kept returning to, under a reason for leaving active service, the file said simply, family circumstances, 2020. His son would have been about 4 in 2020. Sabrina set the file down. He arrived at 10:15. She heard the car on the driveway and watched from the upstairs window for a moment before going down. He drove a clean but ordinary dark blue sedan, the kind of car that was designed not to stand out. He got out carefully, not slowly, but with the kind of deliberate economy of movement that some people had and most didn't. He wore dark pants and a simple gray jacket, no tie. He stood for a moment and looked at the front of the house, and even from this distance, Sabrina could tell he was cataloging the angles. Not nervously, just as a matter of habit. She went downstairs. Rosa let him in, and Sabrina came through from the sitting room with her hand extended before he'd taken 2 steps into the foyer. Mr. Reeve, I'm Sabrina Westcott. Ms. Westcott. His handshake was firm and brief. He had gray eyes, steady and calm, and a quality of stillness about him that she'd occasionally encountered in people who had spent significant time in places where stillness mattered. He wasn't imposing in the way that some security professionals work to be imposing. He was simply present, in a way that was hard to articulate. Can I get you coffee? She asked. I'm fine, thank you. She led him into the sitting room and they sat across from each other. She'd done this 9 times. She'd developed something close to a script for it. The questions she asked, the things she watched for, the early signals that usually told her within 20 minutes whether it was going to work. Tell me what Marcus told you about the position, she said. Single-parent household. 1 child, 7 years old. Previous security arrangements haven't been sustainable. You need someone who can provide coverage without making the home feel like a controlled environment. That's accurate as far as it goes. She looked at him directly. What Marcus may not have told you is that my daughter has developed significant anxiety around strangers over the last 2 years. She's 7, not 17. I want to be clear about that, because some of the people I've interviewed have seemed to think anxiety in children is a behavioral problem they can train out. Something in his face shifted just slightly. It's not. No, it isn't. She paused. She's been through a fair amount of disruption for a child her age. Her father left when she was 3. I've had people cycling through this house on a fairly regular basis, nannies, household staff, and now 9 rounds of security personnel. She's adaptive. But she's also learned, correctly, that strangers often mean change, and change in our world has usually meant something destabilizing. He was quiet for a moment. How does she react to the presence of security, in practical terms? She retreats, she stops talking, she starts having trouble sleeping. Sabrina kept her voice level. The last one, before he called in sick and ended his own tenure, she wouldn't come downstairs for dinner 3 nights in a row because she didn't want to be in the same room with him. Callum didn't respond immediately, and she appreciated that. He seemed to be actually thinking rather than reaching for reassurance. "What does she enjoy?" he asked. Sabrina blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your daughter. What does she like to do?" It wasn't the question she'd expected. "She likes science, specifically animals, marine biology at the moment, though 3 months ago it was insects. She likes drawing. She likes building things, blocks or craft projects. She's learning chess, but she doesn't like losing yet." A pause. "She likes paper airplanes." Something changed in his expression. It was subtle, not dramatic, not a visible flinch or a sharp intake of breath, just a slight stillness, a fraction of a second where he seemed to recalibrate something internally. His eyes didn't move from her face, but something shifted behind them. Sabrina noticed. She filed it away. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing." He said it without any defensive quality, which was interesting. "Just something that occurred to me." Before she could follow the thread, the sitting room door opened. Maisie was not supposed to be home yet. Rosa had taken her to her weekly art class on the other side of the city, an arrangement Sabrina had specifically made so that this morning could unfold without the complication of her daughter's reaction, influencing her own judgment before she'd formed one. But there Maisie was, in the doorway in her coat and boots, cheeks flushed from the cold, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Rosa appeared behind her, looking apologetic. "The class was canceled," Rosa said. "The teacher had a family emergency. I texted—" "It's fine," Sabrina said, already standing. "Maisie, come in. Close the door. It's cold." Maisie came in. She did what she always did around strangers, not retreating all the way, but hovering near the door with her shoulders pulled slightly inward, her eyes going immediately to the unfamiliar man on the other side of the room. Sabrina moved toward her. "This is Mr. Reeve. He's someone I'm talking to about a job." Maisie looked at him. Her expression went through several things in rapid succession. The initial wariness, the familiar tension around her eyes that Sabrina recognized and hated. And then something else. The tension broke. Maisie stared, not with fear, with something that looked remarkably like recognition. Callum Reeve sat very still. Maisie walked across the room, stopping about 3 feet from him, and looked at him the way children look at things they are trying to make sense of, carefully, without self-consciousness. "I know you," she said. "Maisie," Sabrina began. "I do." She said it simply, as if it were a fact she was reporting rather than a claim she was making. She turned to her mother, and what Sabrina saw on her daughter's face was something she had not seen in 14 months of searching. Absolute, uncomplicated ease. Maisie went up on her toes and pressed her mouth to Sabrina's ear. "Mom, I know him, and I really like him." Sabrina pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. Then she looked at Callum Reeve, who was looking at Maisie with an expression that was controlled and careful, and not quite managing to be unreadable. "Mr. Reeve," Sabrina said. Her voice was pleasant, and it was the pleasantness of a woman who had spent 15 years building a company in an industry that did not welcome her, which meant it had a great deal of precision behind it. "I'd like to know if you've met my daughter before." A beat. "Ms. Westcott," he said, "that's a longer answer than it might seem." "Then I suggest you start at the beginning." He looked at Maisie, who was watching him with the open, patient attention of a child who already knew the story and was waiting to hear if the adult would get it right, and then back at Sabrina. "About 6 months ago," he said, "I took my son to the Hargrove Science Museum downtown. There was a fire alarm." Sabrina went very still. She remembered the fire alarm. Rosa had called her from the museum, voice pitched just slightly too high, saying everything was fine, everyone was fine. Maisie had gotten a little separated in the crowd during the evacuation, but it had sorted itself out before she could even get there. Sorted itself out. "It wasn't a drill," Callum continued, and his voice was steady. "The lobby emptied fast. There was a lot of confusion. I came out through the east doors with Noah, my son, and there was a little girl sitting by herself near the fountain. He glanced at Maisie. She was crying, he said. Maisie nodded, unselfconsciously. I was really scared, she confirmed. Sabrina looked at her daughter, then back at him. Go on. I didn't want to startle her. She didn't know me, and a man approaching a frightened child in a public space, I was aware of what that looks like. So I sat down about 10 feet away, and I had Noah start folding paper airplanes. He paused. Noah's very good at paper airplanes. He practices constantly. He gave me one, Maisie said to her mother. It had little wings that were uneven, but it flew really far. She stopped crying, Callum said. We talked for a few minutes. I spotted her nanny about 100 yards out, got Maisie's attention redirected that direction, and once I could see the nanny had her, I left. Sabrina's mouth was dry. You left. I didn't know who she was. I didn't see any reason to make the moment larger than it needed to be. I see. Sabrina sat down because standing suddenly felt effortful. Rosa told me she got separated and then found. In that order. She didn't tell me how. Rosa didn't know, Maisie said. She was looking the other way. Sabrina looked at her daughter. Why didn't you tell me? Maisie considered this with the same seriousness she applied to everything. You were working, and I didn't want you to be more worried. 7 years old, already managing her mother's anxiety like it was something she was responsible for. Sabrina felt that like a hand pressing down on her sternum. She stopped, redirected. We're going to talk about that later. She turned back to Callum. You said that was a longer answer than it seemed. Is there more? His expression remained even. He had the quality of someone who was used to delivering information that was going to be unwelcome and had learned not to lead with apology. Yes, he said. There was a second time. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere past the gray windows, a car passed on the street. The heating system clicked and settled. Sabrina waited, and she was aware that her hands, folded in her lap, were pressing against each other with more force than was necessary. 3 weeks after the museum, Callum said. Noah and I were in Kellerman Park on a Saturday morning. I saw Maisie with her nanny on the east path. He said it directly. No softening. There was a man following them. Sabrina's jaw tightened. I don't know if it was purposeful. I can tell you that he changed direction when they changed direction, twice, and that he closed distance when the nanny stopped to check her phone. He kept his voice neutral, informational. I moved myself and Noah between them and the man, without making a scene. I stayed parallel to them on the path until he gave up and left. Then I took Noah to the other side of the park. Maisie was watching her mother's face carefully. The nanny didn't see him, Callum added. She was distracted. Maisie did. Sabrina looked at her daughter. Maisie gave a small, uncomfortable shrug. He was looking at me weird, but then the man with Noah walked nearby and the weird man went away. So, she pulled at the strap of her backpack. I didn't think it was a big deal. Maisie, Sabrina's voice came out quieter than she intended. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? The answer was the same as before. She could see it in her daughter's face before Maisie said it. I didn't want you to worry more. Sabrina breathed in slowly through her nose and out through her mouth, which was something she'd learned in her second year of running the company when her cardiologist had suggested she either manage her stress differently or accept the consequences. Then she turned back to Callum Reeve, who was watching her with the same measured attention he'd brought to everything else in the last 20 minutes. You encountered my daughter twice, she said. In each case, you intervened and didn't report it. I didn't know who she was, he said. I wasn't in any professional capacity. I saw situations that needed handling, and I handled them. And then you applied for a position as her bodyguard. I applied for a position in your security team. I didn't know it involved your daughter directly until Marcus explained the scope. Sabrina studied him. He held her gaze without discomfort, without the slightly performed steadiness of someone working to appear trustworthy. He just sat there. I have to ask you something, she said, and I want you to understand that I am asking it because I have been doing this for 14 months, and I have learned to ask the things that feel uncomfortable. All right. Is it possible that encountering my daughter twice was not coincidence? The question sat in the air between them. Callum didn't look offended. He looked like someone who had already considered the question himself and had been waiting to see if she was sharp enough to ask it. It's possible, he said. The honesty of it caught her slightly off guard. I've thought about it, he continued. Both encounters were in public locations I frequented with Noah. The museum is 3 blocks from his school. The park is where we go on Saturday mornings. I don't have a good way to prove a negative. I can tell you that I had no knowledge of your daughter's identity or your company's situation before Marcus contacted me, and I can tell you that my record is available for whatever level of scrutiny you want to apply. But I can't make coincidence feel like proof. Sabrina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Maisie, who had sat down cross-legged on the floor at some point, and was watching both of them with the quiet, evaluating attention of a child who understood more than adults generally gave her credit for. What do you think? Sabrina asked her daughter, because she had learned in 7 years that Maisie's instincts about people were almost always worth hearing. Maisie looked at Callum. I think, she said carefully, that he's not lying. And I think his airplane was crooked because Noah made it, not him. And I think... She paused, seeming to decide something. I think he should stay. Callum didn't smile, but something around the edges of his expression did something that wasn't quite the same as not smiling. Sabrina looked back at the file on the table. 14 months. 9 rounds. Her daughter eating dinner alone in her room rather than sit in the same space as the man she was paying to protect her. Mr. Reeve, she said, I'm going to need to run a more thorough background check than what Marcus has already done. I'm going to need to speak with your references personally, and I'm going to need to understand more about what you're not telling me regarding your military service. That's reasonable. I'm also going to need you to understand that if you take this position, you are not just protecting a building or a schedule. You are protecting a child who has spent too much of her short life learning to be afraid of people. And if you make that worse in any way... I understand, he said. She looked at him. I have a son, he said simply. I understand. Sabrina nodded slowly. Outside, the gray October sky had not gotten any lighter. Rosa appeared briefly in the doorway, looked at the 3 of them, and disappeared again with the particular instinct of someone who knew when a room needed to be left alone. Maisie stood up, brushed off her leggings, and picked up her backpack. I'm going to go read about anglerfish, she announced to no one in particular. Then she looked at Callum. The one at the museum was fake. The real ones look way scarier. I know, Callum said. Noah's been drawing them for months. Maisie paused, looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to joy Sabrina had seen on her daughter's face in the presence of a stranger. Does he know about the lure? The bioluminescent one? He knows more about it than I'd like. He tried to recreate one with a flashlight and a fishing hook, and I had to have a conversation about several things at once. Maisie laughed, and then she walked out of the room and up the stairs, and her footsteps were light, and Sabrina sat there listening to them and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, something so unfamiliar it took her a moment to name it. Relief. Not the relief of a problem solved, just the first fragile sense that maybe she was no longer looking at the wrong door. She turned back to the man sitting across from her. I'll be in touch by end of week, she said. I'll be available, he said. And that, for now, was enough. The background check took 4 days. Sabrina had used the same investigative firm for 6 years, a small, expensive outfit run by a former federal prosecutor named Diane Cho, who had the useful quality of being thorough without being theatrical about it. Diane called on a Tuesday evening while Sabrina was sitting at her desk reviewing a procurement contract, and she delivered her findings the way she delivered all findings, directly, in order of significance, without editorializing unless asked. Callum James Reeve, Diane said. Born 1987, Portland, Oregon. Enlisted at 19, service record is partially classified, but the unclassified portions are consistent with elite special operations. Honorable discharge, October 2020. Wife was Nora Reeve, née Castellano. She died February 2020. Cardiac event, no prior history. She was 31. A brief pause. His son Noah was 4 years old. Sabrina set down her pen. Since discharge, he's done independent security consulting. 3 long-term assignments, all verifiable. One reference, a woman named Patricia Harmon, ran a family office in Boston, called him the best professional decision she ever made, and said she was still annoyed he'd left when they relocated to Geneva. Diane's voice was dry. The other two references were similarly enthusiastic, which I find slightly suspicious in anyone, but I couldn't find any contradiction worth noting. Financials? Modest. He owns his apartment outright, bought it 3 years ago. No debt beyond a car payment. He lives within his means, which for a man with his apparent skill set means he's deliberately choosing a quieter life than he could have. Criminal? Nothing. Not even a speeding ticket in the last 4 years. Sabrina tapped her pen against the contract. The classified portions of his service record. I can tell you what I can infer, not what I confirmed. The gap in his record, the nature of the redactions, and the way his references describe his operational instincts all point towards special operations at a tier that doesn't get discussed in polite company. I'd be very surprised if he wasn't a SEAL. He hasn't said so. No, Diane agreed. He probably won't either. That kind of background, men who've been through that kind of training, they don't talk about it the way people expect them to. The ones who do are usually the ones who didn't see the worst of it. Sabrina absorbed this. Is there anything that gives you pause? She asked. Anything at all. Diane was quiet for a moment, which meant she was actually considering rather than giving the reflexive answer. Nothing that constitutes a flag. The thing that sits with me is the coincidence question. Your daughter twice, unannounced. I can't find any connection between him and your company or anyone associated with it prior to Marcus Hale's outreach. No digital footprint placing him near your family's regular locations outside of those 2 incidents. If it was manufactured by someone with resources I can't find evidence of. Another pause. My honest read is that it's what it appears to be. But I've been wrong before, and I tell every client that. Sabrina thanked her and sat with the phone in her hand for a while after the call ended. She thought about Maisie, cross-legged on the sitting room floor. I think he should stay. She thought about the nanny who had been distracted, about the park, about a man closing distance while Rosa checked her phone and her daughter watched with quiet, frightened eyes, and didn't tell anyone because she didn't want to cause more worry. She called Marcus the next morning. Tell Reeve he's hired, she said. 60-day trial period, standard NDA, and I want a full briefing on schedule and protocols before his first day. I'll set it up, Marcus said. Good decision, Sabrina. She didn't respond to that. She wasn't sure yet whether it was. Callum started on a Monday. He arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes before Sabrina had asked him to, and she found him in the kitchen talking to Rosa about the coffee maker, which had been behaving erratically for 2 weeks. By the time Sabrina came downstairs, he'd identified the problem. A scale buildup in the heating element. And Rosa was looking at him the way Rosa looked at people who solved problems without being asked to, which was with the immediate and unconditional approval. Ms. Westcott. He straightened when she came in. Callum. She'd decided on first names the night before, partly because Mr. Reeve was going to wear thin in a household context, and partly because she was aware that formality in domestic settings had a way of making people perform rather than function. Coffee's broken. Mineral buildup. If you have white vinegar, I can run a cycle. Rosa knows where it is. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Maisie will be down in about 20 minutes. She's been up since 6. She does that on days when she's anxious about something new. He nodded, absorbing this without comment. She knows you're starting today. She's been asking questions about Noah. Something in his expression shifted, a slight softening around the eyes that he probably wasn't fully aware of. What kind of questions? Whether he's good at chess, whether he's ever had a dog, whether his paper airplanes always fly crooked. Sabrina allowed herself a small, dry smile. I told her I didn't have that information. The chess, he's decent for his age, but he gets impatient. The dog, we talked about it and decided against it for now. We're not home enough. The airplanes, a corner of his mouth moved. They're getting straighter. He practices. I'll relay that. She paused. I want to be clear about something before we settle into any kind of routine. My schedule is available to you through the household calendar. What I ask is that you treat that information with the same care you'd treat classified material. Not because I'm paranoid, but because I've had situations where schedule information ended up somewhere it shouldn't have. He looked at her steadily. What kind of situations? She'd decided to be direct about this. She'd almost not been, had considered easing him into the context over a few weeks. But the background check had settled something in her about trusting her own instincts. 3 incidents in the last year. Small ones, nothing that escalated into anything serious on its face. But the timing, each time, correlated with changes I'd made to my calendar or Maisie's schedule. Could be coincidence, probably is, but I've started to wonder. He was quiet for a moment. Who has access to the calendar? My EA, Marcus, Rosa, the household manager who left in September, and the previous 3 security personnel. Did any of the incidents happen after the household manager left? She blinked. It was a sharp question, asked quickly and without preamble. Yes, 2 of the 3. So it's not her. He said it without satisfaction, just as a narrowing of the field. I'd like to review the incident reports when you have time, just to understand the pattern. I'll have copies sent to you. He nodded, and that was that. No reassurance, no promise to get to the bottom of it, no performance of competence. Just the acknowledgement and the next practical step. Sabrina thought about Diane's words. The ones who've seen the worst of it don't talk about it the way people expect. Maisie came downstairs at 8:03, still in her socks, carrying a library book about cephalopods she'd apparently been reading since 6. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom when she saw Callum, but it wasn't the stop Sabrina was used to. The freeze, the slight lean back, the eyes going to her mother for permission. It was something different, a recalibration. "You're here," Maisie said. "I am," Callum said. "Is Noah at school?" "He is, same time as you'll be going." Maisie considered this. "His school starts at 8? 8:15. Mine's 8:30. She came down the last 2 steps and went to the refrigerator, apparently satisfied. "Do you want to see my book? It's about octopuses, but also squids." "Sure." "After I eat." She got out the orange juice with the focused efficiency of a child who had been managing her own breakfast for long enough to have opinions about the process. "Mom, the coffee maker smells weird." "Callum's fixing it." Maisie glanced over at him. "Do you know how to fix things?" "Some things." "Our dishwasher makes a grinding noise on the second cycle." "Maisie," Sabrina said, "I'm just telling him." She poured her juice without spilling any of it, which was not always the outcome, and sat down at the table. "You don't have to fix it. I was just saying." Callum looked at Sabrina. She gave the very slight shrug of a mother who had long since stopped trying to redirect every conversational tangent her daughter produced. "I can take a look at it," he said to Maisie. "Okay." She opened her book. The giant Pacific octopus can unscrew jar lids. They figured that out by giving them jars with food inside. "I knew that," Callum said. Maisie looked up, surprised and pleased. "How?" "Noah went through an octopus phase last year. I know more about cephalopods than I ever expected to." The expression on Maisie's face was not a smile exactly. It was something warmer than that, something closer to recognition. The look of a child who has spent a long time feeling like the things she cared about were too specific and too strange for most people to follow. Suddenly finding someone on the other side of the table who had been to the same strange country through a different door. Sabrina watched this from across the kitchen and said nothing. The first 2 weeks were imperfect in the ways that first weeks tend to be. Callum was careful. Not cautiously, stiffly careful, but thoughtfully so, in a way that suggested he was making deliberate choices rather than defaulting to protocol. He didn't shadow Maisie in the way the previous guards had, the constant presence at 3 feet that had made her feel like a specimen being observed. He positioned himself differently, present at perimeter, visible when needed, genuinely in the background when not. At school drop-off, he stayed by the car rather than walking her to the door, which was what Maisie wanted, and which the previous 3 guards had refused to accommodate because it wasn't in their security assessment. There were frictions. He and Sabrina disagreed twice in the first week about schedule decisions. Once about a last-minute change to Maisie's after-school pickup route that Sabrina had made without consulting him, and once about a public event Sabrina had accepted that he felt was poorly secured. Neither disagreement was dramatic. They had the quality of 2 people who were both accustomed to being right in their respective domains and were working out the boundary between those domains. "You don't need to approve my social calendar," Sabrina said during the second conversation, which happened in the hallway outside her office at 8:30 in the evening. "I'm not trying to," Callum said. I'm telling you that the venue's private security company has 3 open complaints with the city licensing board, and the layout puts your position relative to the main entrance in a way I can't adequately manage with one person. Then I'll bring additional coverage for the evening. That's all I'm asking." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them was angry exactly, but neither was fully comfortable, and Sabrina thought that was probably healthy. The alternative was a man who agreed with her to keep the peace, and she'd had enough of those. "I'll call Marcus about supplemental coverage," she said. "Thank you." He turned to leave and she said, "Callum." He stopped. "You can tell me when you think I'm wrong. That's part of why you're here. Just," she chose the words, "be straight with me about what's a genuine security concern and what's a preference." "I can do that." "Good." He left, and she stood in the hallway for a moment, and then went back into her office and finished reviewing the contract. The disagreements were manageable. What wasn't manageable, what Sabrina found herself increasingly unable to categorize or set aside, was the thing happening between the children. Noah started coming on Saturdays. This had not been part of any plan. It emerged gradually, the way things in households tend to emerge, through small accommodations that build into patterns. The first Saturday, Callum had a scheduling conflict with Noah's regular weekend arrangement and asked, carefully, whether it would be acceptable for Noah to accompany them to Maisie's science class field trip to the Botanical Conservatory. Sabrina had said yes because the alternative was Callum missing work or Maisie missing the trip, and both seemed like worse options. Maisie and Noah spent 3 hours in the conservatory together, arguing in the focused, companionable way of children who have already decided they like each other and are now establishing the terms. They disagreed about whether the Venus flytrap display was more interesting than the carnivorous pitcher plant display. Noah maintained that the flytrap was objectively superior because it moved. Maisie countered that movement was less important than digestive sophistication. Neither convinced the other, and both seemed satisfied with this outcome. On the drive home, Maisie fell asleep with her head against the car window, and Noah sat beside her reading a book about paper folding, and Callum drove, and Sabrina sat in the front passenger seat and looked at the 3 of them in the rearview mirror and felt something she didn't want to look at too directly yet. The second Saturday, Maisie asked at breakfast whether Noah was coming again. "I don't know," Sabrina said. "That's a question for Callum." "Can you ask him?" "You can ask him." Maisie considered the social mechanics of this. What if he says no? Then Noah isn't coming this Saturday. But would he say no for a reason, or just because of rules? Sabrina set down her coffee. "You're going to have this conversation yourself, Maisie." Maisie went and found Callum in the front hallway where he was reviewing the security log. And Sabrina heard, from the kitchen, a conversation she couldn't quite make out, but whose emotional shape was entirely legible. The slight hesitancy of a child making a request they care about, followed by a pause, followed by what sounded like a yes. Noah came both Saturdays after that. By the 4th week, it wasn't an event. It was just Saturday. It was during the 5th week that things stopped being a staffing arrangement and started being something Sabrina couldn't entirely categorize. She came home early from a meeting that had ended faster than expected, and she let herself in through the side entrance because the front gate code was taking too long to enter on her phone, and she walked into the kitchen and found all 3 of them at the table. Noah and Maisie were playing chess. Noah moving quickly and with the impatient confidence of someone who expected to win. Maisie moving slowly and with the focused intensity of someone who had decided not to. Callum was at the far end of the table eating a sandwich and reading something on his phone, and the television in the adjacent room was on low with some nature documentary about migratory birds that no one was watching. None of them heard her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment. It wasn't domestic in any performed or idealized way. Noah knocked over his water glass, reaching for a piece, soaking 2 pawns and part of the board, and said a word that made Callum look up sharply and say his name in a flat warning tone. And Noah had the grace to look at Maisie and apologize with visible discomfort. Maisie patted the wet board with her sleeve in a businesslike way and said it was fine. They kept playing. Callum went back to his phone. Sabrina stood there another moment, and then she backed quietly out of the doorway and went up the back stairs to her office, and she sat down and stared at her desk and did not immediately reach for her email. She was thinking about what the inside of this house had felt like 18 months ago. The silence that had a different quality than quiet. Maisie eating dinner in her room. The security reports stacking up with their accumulated record of failure. The way Sabrina had moved through her own home, like she was passing through it rather than living in it. She reached for her email, but the image stayed with her. The third incident happened on a Thursday, and it was not small. Sabrina had a board presentation at the downtown Westcott Aeronautics offices, a quarterly review that required her physical presence and that she hadn't been able to reschedule when Maisie's school closed unexpectedly for a half day due to a burst pipe in the gymnasium. Callum adjusted without complaint, rerouting Maisie to the corporate offices for the afternoon rather than the house, setting her up in a small conference room with her homework and a cleared tablet for approved entertainment. The offices had their own security team, separate from the household detail. Callum knew the setup and had used the building before, but he'd expressed quietly to Sabrina before they left that he preferred her regular schedule to ad hoc changes when it could be avoided. "It's not avoidable today," she'd said. "I know, I'm not arguing, I'm just noting it." She'd noted his noting and moved on. The presentation ran long. Presentations always ran long when the CFO was in the room and the numbers had any ambiguity in them. Sabrina was 60 minutes into an expected 40-minute slot when her phone buzzed with a message from Callum. "Maisie, fine, heads up. Staff member I don't recognize tried to access the conference room twice. Told both times she was in a private meeting. She's with me now." Sabrina read it once, kept her expression neutral, and wrapped the presentation in 8 minutes. She found them in the security monitoring room on the building's second floor, which was not where she'd left them. Maisie was on a rolling chair eating crackers from her lunch bag and watching 2 screens that showed elevator feeds. Callum was standing near the door, and the building's head of on-site security, a man named Garrett, was near the terminal looking like a man who was managing his feelings about someone operating in his space without invitation. "Who was it?" Sabrina asked, before anyone could offer context. "Female, mid-30s, access badge from the legal department," Callum said. "She doesn't appear on the floor manifest I was given before we came in. I checked with Garrett. She's a contractor, brought on 6 weeks ago. Not a regular staff member." Garrett cleared his throat. "Ms. Westcott, I want to be clear that our screening— I'm not criticizing your screening, Garrett. I'm asking questions." She looked at Callum. "Did she make contact with Maisie?" "No. First time I redirected her before she reached the door. Second time I asked her directly what she needed, and she said she was looking for a printer. The nearest printer to that conference room is 40 feet in the other direction and behind a different set of keycard access." Sabrina's jaw was tight. "I want her badge suspended pending review." "Already requested," Garrett said. "Thank you." She looked at Maisie. "Are you okay?" "I'm good," Maisie said, with the slightly overmeasured calm of a child who was watching adult faces for information. "Callum said we were just being careful. I watched the elevator cameras. Did you know this building has 16 cameras on the parking level alone?" "I didn't know that number specifically. It's a lot." Maisie ate a cracker. "Is everything okay?" Sabrina looked at her daughter, 7 years old, sitting in a monitoring room eating crackers, doing what Maisie had always done, which was read the room and manage her own reaction to protect everyone around her, and felt the familiar, complicated weight of that. "Everything is fine," she said. "Let's go home." In the car, with Maisie asleep in the back 20 minutes outside the city, she always crashed after what she politely called a lot of day. Sabrina said quietly to Callum, "The contractor. What's your read?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Could be nothing. Could be curiosity. Building staff sometimes get nosy about executive visitors." He paused. "But it's the third time in about 6 weeks that something low-level has happened near Maisie outside the house." Sabrina turned to look at him. "The museum alarm," he said. "The man in the park. This. None of them are individually significant, but I've been looking at the dates against the incident reports you gave me." "And?" "The museum alarm happened 2 days after you confirmed a public appearance for Maisie at the Aviation Heritage Gala. That appearance was on your shared calendar at the time." His voice was still even. "The park encounter happened the Saturday after you added Maisie's Saturday science class to the schedule. That was also on the shared calendar." Sabrina was very still. "Today," he continued, "was not on any standing schedule. It was an ad hoc change made this morning. Only 4 people knew about it before we left the house." "Rosa," Sabrina said. "Marcus, my EA." "And me," Callum said. I'm aware of that. She looked at his profile. I was watching the road with the same even attention he brought to everything. You're telling me you think someone with access to my internal calendar has been feeding information about Maisie's movements, she said. I think it's worth taking seriously. Marcus has managed my security arrangements for 4 years. Callum didn't respond to that directly. I'm not pointing at anyone. I'm pointing at a pattern. What you do with it is your call. Sabrina turned and looked at Maisie in the back seat, her daughter, asleep now with her mouth slightly open and her library book sliding off her lap, entirely unaware of the conversation happening 6 feet away. 3 incidents. 3 correlations with calendar entries. The contractor today had walked to the wrong printer twice. I want to run a test, Sabrina said. What kind of test? I want to put a false event on the calendar. Something specific enough that if it's used, it'll be identifiable. And then I want to see what happens. He was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable approach. You'd need to keep the circle small. People who see the false entry and people who don't. I know how to run a controlled test, she said, and there was an edge in it, the edge of a woman who had spent 15 years being underestimated in rooms where she was the only one in the room who understood the actual problem. I know you do, he said simply. Not defensive, not conciliatory, just acknowledging. She exhaled slowly. I'll set it up this week, she said. I want you to keep the pattern analysis, dates, locations, calendar access timestamps if you can get them. I can get some of them. For the full access logs, I'd need Marcus to pull them. Neither of them said what that meant. They both understood it. The car moved through the dark on the highway, and Maisie slept, and Sabrina watched the lights of the city recede behind them and thought about 14 months of trying to protect her daughter from threats she could identify and name. It hadn't occurred to her, until now, that the harder problem might be the ones that didn't have names yet, the ones sitting inside her own structure, wearing the right badge, knowing the right schedule. She thought about Callum in the museum, sitting 10 feet from a crying child with a box of paper squares, deliberately not approaching, making himself unthreatening in the one way that would actually work. She thought about the park, and a stranger closing distance, and a man she didn't know stepping quietly into the space between her daughter and that stranger without making a scene. She didn't know yet whether hiring him had been coincidence or something else, but she was beginning to understand that coincidence or not, he had been paying attention to her daughter before anyone asked him to, and that in the current moment, that mattered more than anything else. Callum, she said. Yeah. The first time you saw Maisie at the museum, when she was crying, she looked at her hands in her lap. How long did it take before she stopped? He considered this. 6, 7 minutes, maybe. Noah got through his 3rd airplane before she smiled. What did she say? Before you got her back to the nanny? She asked if the airplane was named after anyone. I said Noah named all of them. He usually picked dinosaurs. She said hers should be named after an anglerfish. He glanced briefly at the rearview mirror, at Maisie. She was very specific about which one. The deep-sea species, not the freshwater. Sabrina pressed her lips together. She would not do this here, in the car, in the dark. She was practiced at this. Thank you, she said, for both times. It wasn't... He stopped. Started differently. Anyone would have. No, she said quietly. They wouldn't have. He didn't argue with that. Outside, the highway lights blurred past, and Maisie made a small sound in her sleep and didn't wake, and the car carried them home through the dark with the steady, unremarkable reliability of a thing that simply kept working, which was, Sabrina was beginning to understand, the most important quality anything could have. The false calendar entry went up on a Wednesday. It was elegant in its specificity, a notation that Maisie would be attending a private birthday party at the Kellerman Park Recreation Center the following Saturday, 11 in the morning, with a guest list of 6 children from her class. No party existed. No invitations had been sent. It was a piece of bait built from the exact kind of routine, semi-public information that would be useless to anyone with innocent intentions and very useful to anyone who was tracking her daughter's movements. Sabrina put it in the shared calendar at 9 in the morning on Wednesday and told no one she'd done it. Then she waited. On Saturday morning at 10:50, a car with no plates registered to anyone connected to Westcott Aeronautics parked on the east side of Kellerman Park near the recreation center. It sat there for 40 minutes. The driver was photographed by a traffic camera at the park's northern entrance. Sabrina received the photograph by text at 11:43, forwarded by the private investigator she'd retained separately from Marcus's team, separately from anything that touched her company's internal systems. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she called Diane Cho. "I need you to find out," she said, "who sent a car to Kellerman Park this morning and why. I'll need the plate." "There isn't one." A pause. "Then I'll need more." "I'll send you the photograph." "Sabrina," Diane's voice was careful, "if this is what it sounds like, I know what it sounds like. That's why I'm calling you and not Marcus." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll get back to you by Monday," Diane said. Sabrina ended the call. She was sitting at her kitchen table, and from the back garden she could hear Maisie and Noah arguing cheerfully about something that involved a lot of running, and Callum's voice once, low and even, saying something that sounded like a rule being established. She looked at the photograph again. 14 months, 9 bodyguards. 3 small incidents she'd told herself were probably nothing. Probably nothing. She put her phone face down on the table and went to stand at the back door, watching the 3 of them in the yard. Maisie with her arms out for balance crossing something, Noah already on the other side pointing back at where she'd almost fallen, Callum a little distance away with his arms crossed and his eyes not on the children specifically, but on the yard as a whole, the fence line, the gate, the sight lines. He looked up and saw her in the doorway. Nothing changed in his expression. He just registered her presence and went back to watching the yard. She went back inside and picked up her phone and wrote a message to Diane. "Monday is fine, but if you find what I think you're going to find, I need you to make sure the documentation is airtight before I do anything with it. I'm not going to move on this until I'm certain." Diane wrote back 3 words. "That's the job." Sabrina set the phone down again. From the yard, Maisie's voice came through the window, bright and precise with the focus of a child who had figured something out. "It's about balance, Noah, not speed. You have to commit to the center of gravity." And Noah grumbling but listening. "How do you know about center of gravity?" And Maisie, with 7-year-old authority. "Science class. It's a whole unit." And then both of them laughing, and the sound of feet on grass. And Sabrina sat with her back to the window, and the photograph face down on the table, and let the sound of that laughter be the thing she held on to, while everything else she'd believed about her company's security started, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart. Diane called on Monday at 7 in the morning, which meant she'd been working through the weekend, which meant what she'd found was significant enough that she hadn't wanted to wait. Sabrina was already up. She'd been up since 5:30, which was not unusual when something was sitting unresolved in the back of her mind. She took the call in her office with the door closed and her coffee going cold on the desk beside her. "The car," Diane said, without preamble. "It's a rental, paid for in cash through a third-party booking service, the kind that doesn't require a credit card if you know how to use it. The driver is a man named Terrence Gould. Small-time private investigation work, mostly domestic disputes and insurance fraud. No criminal record, but 2 former clients have filed complaints about methods." A pause. "He was hired through an intermediary. The intermediary has done work before for a company called Stratford Consulting Group." "I know Stratford," Sabrina said carefully. "I thought you might. They've done advisory work for at least 3 of your board members individually, and they have a consulting contract with Westcott Aeronautics that runs through end of next year." Sabrina's hand tightened slightly around the phone. "Stratford's principal client contact at Westcott," Diane continued, "is Marcus Hale." The office was very quiet. Outside the window, the November morning was still mostly dark. The sky, the particular blue-gray of pre-dawn that looked almost peaceful if you weren't paying attention to what was underneath it. "How solid is this?" Sabrina said. "The Stratford connection to the intermediary is solid. The intermediary to Gould connection is solid. Gould's car, Gould's presence at Kellerman Park Saturday, that's documented." Diane's voice was careful. "The direct line from Marcus to this specific action. I can show you the structure, but I can't yet show you a conversation or a payment that puts his hands directly on Saturday's operation. That piece is still circumstantial. But the pattern is very clear. Someone with access to your household calendar and your internal security structure has been leaking movement information, and the only person sitting at the intersection of all 3 incidents with both calendar access and a relationship with Stratford is Marcus. Another pause. Sabrina, I've been doing this a long time. I know what I'm looking at. What does Stratford want? She said, because that was the real question. The mechanism didn't matter yet. The purpose did. I'm still building that piece, but what I can tell you is that Westcott Aeronautics has a government contract renewal coming up in the first quarter. The propulsion systems work, the one that's been in the news. There are two other companies bidding against you. Both of them have board-level relationships with Stratford's parent firm. Diane let that sit for a moment. I don't think the goal was to hurt your daughter. I think the goal was to destabilize you enough that you'd make decisions from a position of fear rather than strength. Frightened executives make contract concessions. They bring in outside consultants. They restructure in ways that create openings. Sabrina thought about the 9 bodyguards, the 9 carefully assembled failures, the constant low-grade pressure of an insecure home environment, compounding on top of a high-stakes professional environment, wearing her down in increments so gradual she hadn't recognized them as a strategy. He recommended them, she said, half to herself. Marcus recommended most of the bodyguards who failed. He was the one who dismissed several of them. I noticed that too. She sat with this for a moment. 14 years of trust. A man she'd handed her schedule to, her daughter's schedule, the layout of her home and her family's routines, because he had earned that access through a decade and a half of apparently solid work, or through a decade and a half of building toward this. What do I do? She said, and it wasn't a question exactly, more the thing a person says aloud to organize the weight of a decision. You don't move yet, Diane said. You don't confront him. You don't adjust his access in any way he'd notice. And you do not brief anyone inside your company's security structure until I have documentation tight enough that there's no room for him to construct an alternative explanation. A beat. And you tell Callum Reeve, today. Sabrina looked at her desk. He's the only person currently in your security detail who we can confirm has no connection to Stratford or Marcus's network. And if Marcus is aware that you're getting close to this, which he may be, he's not stupid, you're going to need someone positioned to respond to something physical, not just administrative. You think it escalates. I think men who've built something this carefully don't walk away from it without trying to protect their investment first. Diane's voice was flat. Tell Reeve today, Sabrina. She ended the call and sat in her office until the sky outside went from blue-gray to the pale, watery light of early November morning. Then she got up, went downstairs, and found Callum already there, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, reading something on his phone. He looked up when she came in. She said, "Close the door." He did. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was simply how he processed. Not passivity, but a kind of focused absorption that gathered information before it responded to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his coffee cooling in his hand. Marcus knew my background, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a piece of the picture sliding into place. He knew it before he recommended me. Yes. So either he made a mistake recommending someone actually qualified, or he underestimated what you'd notice, she said, or he thought he could manage you the way he managed the others. She looked at him directly. I've been thinking about that. He couldn't have known about the museum or the park. Those were real. Whatever he's built around us, he didn't manufacture your history with Maisie. Callum set down his coffee. No, he didn't. Which means when he recommended you, he was working from your resume and your references. He probably thought he was getting another competent professional who'd handle the position adequately without looking too closely at the underlying structure. She paused. He didn't account for the fact that you'd already been paying attention to my daughter for 6 months before you walked through that door. Something moved across his face. Not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person being told that a thing they did without thinking about it turned out to matter in ways they hadn't anticipated. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to keep operating normally. Same schedule, same behavior, nothing that signals to Marcus that anything has changed. She looked at her hands. And I need you to help me understand what we're actually exposed to, physically, while Diane finishes building the documentation. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. He has access to your calendar, your home's security layout, your daughter's routine. He's had 14 months to map this household's patterns. He said it evenly, not to alarm her, but because she'd asked for the honest assessment, and he was giving it. If he decides to move before you can move on him, He'll know the best windows. Probably a transit moment, somewhere between the house and a destination, somewhere the environment can be managed. Like a parking structure, she said. He looked at her. Is there a specific reason you said that? The quarterly executive security review. It's in 3 weeks. Underground parking, 3 levels, adjacent to the Westcott Tower. It's been on the calendar for 2 months. Marcus has known about it since it was scheduled. She watched his face. Maisie was going to stay at the office with me for the afternoon. I'd planned to bring her along because the schools have a teacher in service day. Callum was still. That's in your calendar too? Yes. He picked up his coffee, then put it back down without drinking any of it. He'd have the parking level layout, your likely entry and exit points, and he'd know Maisie would be with you. Yes, she said again. You're not canceling it, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been paying attention. If I cancel it, he knows something has shifted. Diane needs another week at minimum for documentation that will hold up. I can't afford to spook him before she has what she needs. She looked at him steadily. But I'm not walking my daughter into that parking structure without being honest with you about what I think the risk is. He nodded slowly. Outside from upstairs, they could hear the sound of feet on the floor. Maisie up early again, which was her pattern when she was anxious. Though what she was anxious about on this particular Tuesday morning was probably the math test she'd mentioned 3 times the night before, and not the adult conversation happening 2 floors below her. Maisie stays home that day, Callum said. Marcus will notice the deviation. Not if the calendar still shows her there. Change it the morning of, with a reason that reads as domestic. She's sick. Rosa has a conflict. Something that sounds like logistics rather than strategy. He paused. He'll adapt, but it gives you the documentation window Diane needs without exposing her. Sabrina looked at him. And me? You go, with me. His voice was level. If he's going to move, he moves on you. On the leverage that actually affects a board-level decision. Maisie is pressure. You're the decision maker. He met her eyes. If he wants to demonstrate that you're vulnerable enough to negotiate from a position of fear, he needs you in that garage. She understood what he was saying. She also understood what he was offering, which was to stand between her and whatever Marcus Hale had decided her vulnerability was worth. You're not 9 men, she said. No, he agreed. I'm not. She looked at him for a moment long. Then she nodded. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he said. The days between that conversation and the executive review had a strange quality. Outwardly unchanged, inwardly taut. Sabrina went to work. She took meetings. She reviewed contracts. She sat across from Marcus Hale in a Tuesday briefing and discussed supplemental coverage protocols for the upcoming holiday season. And she looked at the man she'd trusted for 14 years and kept her voice completely even and her expression completely open and gave away nothing. It was the hardest professional performance of her life, and she had performed through harder moments than most people would ever encounter. Callum was a different kind of difficult. He didn't change his behavior in any way that Marcus would register, but Sabrina could see the difference in him now that she was looking for it. A slightly heightened quality of attention, the way his eyes moved through spaces they entered, the way he positioned himself relative to her in public settings. Not nervously, methodically, like someone running calculations that never fully stopped. At home, though, he was careful not to let it show. This was the thing she hadn't expected about him, the deliberate compartmentalization, the ability to be genuinely present with the children in a way that didn't carry the weight of what he was quietly managing around them. On the Wednesday evening of that first week, he sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes, while Maisie walked him through her method for folding a paper crane, and he was patient with it in a way that did not look like patience being performed, but like someone who actually had nowhere else to be in that moment. Maisie's crane was better than Noah's. Noah had acknowledged this with visible reluctance, and Callum had said that Noah had more time to practice, and they'd revisit the comparison in a month, and Noah had immediately gone to find more paper, and Maisie had looked at Callum with the specific satisfaction of a child who had just been handed a fair outcome by an adult and found it surprising enough to be worth noticing. You didn't just say mine was better to make me feel good, she said. It was better, he said simply. But he'll catch up. Most adults just say they're both great, Maisie observed, with the mild contempt of someone who had been subjected to this many times. Most adults underestimate kids. Maisie considered this. My dad used to do that, she said, with the particular flatness children use when they're describing something they've processed enough to discuss without crying but haven't fully finished feeling. Say that's great, honey, about everything, even the bad ones. Callum didn't respond with condolence or redirection. He just said, "What happened to the bad ones?" "I threw them away myself," Maisie said. "The ones I was proud of I kept." "That's the right system," he said. Maisie nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to folding. Sabrina, who had been standing in the doorway long enough to hear most of this, went quietly back to the hallway before either of them saw her. She stood in the hallway for a moment, just standing. Diane delivered the final documentation on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days before the security review. She sent it in encrypted form and followed up with a call that lasted 40 minutes and covered every thread of the structure she'd assembled. The Stratford connection, the calendar access logs she'd managed to obtain through a source inside Westcott's IT infrastructure, who did not know what the logs were being used for, 3 payments from a shell entity traced back to Stratford's operational accounts, deposited into a brokerage account connected to Marcus Hale through his brother-in-law. It was enough. More than enough. "You can take this to your legal team and your board," Diane said. "Today, if you want." Not yet. Sabrina was at her desk, the encrypted files open on her screen, 14 years of trust compressed into 40 pages of documentation. 3 more days. "Sabrina, he doesn't know we have this. The moment I move on it, he knows. If he has anything planned for the review, tipping him off now might push the timeline." She paused. "I need him to believe he still has the upper hand until I have everything I need from that day." Diane was quiet for a moment. "What exactly are you planning?" "I'm planning to do exactly what I was always planning to do. Attend my quarterly security review, demonstrate that I'm not frightened, and let him make whatever move he's been building toward. With documentation running, with Callum in position, and with everything already prepared to bring down around his ears the moment it's over." Another pause, longer. "That's a significant personal risk." "Yes," she said. "But Maisie won't be there. And I've been taking significant personal risks since I was 24 years old, and nobody in this industry believed a woman could run an aerospace company." She closed the file. "I'm not hiding in my house while someone dismantles what I built." Diane exhaled. "You're going to tell me to be ready to move the moment you give the word." "Yes." "All right. A beat. Be careful." "I have a Navy SEAL," Sabrina said, and surprised herself slightly with the dryness in her own voice. Diane made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "From what you've told me, that might be exactly enough." The morning of the review, Maisie woke up with what appeared to be a genuine stomachache, which Sabrina felt, privately and without expressing it, was the universe's way of occasionally making the difficult things slightly less complicated. She settled Maisie on the couch with a heating pad, and Rosa nearby and her cephalopod encyclopedia kissed her forehead and went to get ready. She found Callum already in the front hallway, jacket on, checking his phone. He looked up when she came down. "How is she?" he said. "Genuinely unwell, which actually helps." She kept her voice low. "Rosa knows not to let anyone in, not to confirm our location to anyone who calls, and to contact Diane directly if anything seems wrong. I briefed her this morning," he said. Sabrina looked at him. "When?" 6:30, before Maisie was up. His voice was calm. "Rosa's steadier than she looks. She needed the context to respond correctly, so I gave it to her. Sabrina would have an opinion about this later, about the fact that he'd made that call without consulting her. But this was not the moment for that conversation, and the honest assessment was that he'd been right to do it, and she knew it. "Fine, what else?" "I've been in contact with a former colleague. He's positioned in the lobby of the Westcott Tower as of 40 minutes ago. Civilian clothes, no obvious connection to either of us. If anything happens in the parking structure and I need backup response, he can be there in under 2 minutes." He paused. "I didn't tell you in advance because I didn't want to give you more variables to manage. I'm telling you now because you should know." She studied him. "Who is he?" "Someone I trust with my life," Callum said, and his voice had the flat certainty of a man who had had occasion to know exactly who that person was. "He won't be needed, but he'll be there." She nodded. "All right. Ready?" "Yes," she said, and picked up her bag, and they went. The Westcott Aeronautics Tower was 42 stories of glass and steel in the central business district, the kind of building that was built to communicate permanence and authority, which had been entirely intentional when Sabrina commissioned it 6 years earlier. The underground parking structure ran 3 levels beneath it. Secure access, keycard required, camera coverage on the main drives, and elevator banks, but with known gaps on the lower level near the maintenance corridor that Sabrina had flagged in a facilities report 8 months ago and that had not yet been addressed. She knew Marcus knew about the gaps. She'd discussed them with him at the time. The review was scheduled for 2 o'clock. They arrived at 1:40 and went down to the B2 level to verify the setup, a standard part of any advance, Callum had told her, the kind of thing that looked routine. The garage was quiet at this hour, the middle of the day cycle when most of the morning arrivals had settled, and the afternoon departures hadn't started. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete. Callum moved slightly ahead of her, not dramatically, just enough to be between her and anything that came from a forward angle. She'd noticed him do this in other settings, and had never commented on it. It wasn't something he thought about. It was just how he was oriented. They reached the elevator bank, and he stopped. She saw it the same moment he did. The elevator panel was dark. Not in the way panels go dark when a car is in use. Dark in the way they go dark when power has been cut. Callum said quietly, "Don't move." She didn't. He turned a slow, deliberate 180, scanning the level. The fluorescents were still on in the main drive, but the section nearest the maintenance corridor was dimmer than it should have been, and the overhead camera at the northeast corner had its indicator light off. "Staged," he said, still very quiet. "Power cut is selective. They killed the elevator and the northeast camera. Main lighting is on because pulling it would trigger the building's emergency protocols." He looked at her. "They want us contained, not noticed." "How many?" she said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "I don't know yet." He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the gaps between parked cars, the shadow near the maintenance door, the angles. "Stay close behind me. We're going toward the B1 stairwell, not the elevators." "That's away from—" "The main entrance has a camera that's still active. Once we're on B1, we're on record, and their leverage drops significantly." He glanced back at her. "Trust me." She did. She hadn't known until this moment exactly how completely, but she did. They moved. They'd covered about 30 feet when the maintenance door opened. 2 men came through it. Not rushing. They moved with the controlled pace of people who had done this kind of thing before and who believed they had the situation structured the way they'd planned it. They were dressed unremarkably. One of them was holding something at his side that Sabrina didn't look at directly, because looking at it would be useful to neither of them right now. "Ms. Westcott," said the one in front. His voice was professionally neutral. "We just need a few minutes of your time." Callum had stopped. Sabrina stopped behind him. "We don't want any trouble," the man continued. He sounded like someone who said this often, and whose definition of trouble was specific and self-serving. "There's a conversation your board needs to have about the propulsion contract." Mr. Hale thought a quiet setting might be more conducive than— "Mr. Hale," Callum said. Not a question, a notation. The man looked at him for the first time with the slightly recalibrated attention of someone encountering something that doesn't match the briefing. Callum was standing still, hands at his sides, shoulders easy, weight distributed in a way that would read as relaxed to someone who wasn't paying attention and as something entirely different to someone who was. "This doesn't need to involve you," the man said. "It does," Callum said. "Walk away." The man looked at his companion. Some negotiation happened in that glance. "There are 2 of us," the man said, and there was a slightly different quality in his voice now. Not threatening exactly, but adjusting the terms. "I know," Callum said. And then things happened quickly. Later, Sabrina would reconstruct it in the way people reconstruct things that happen faster than comprehension. In pieces, in order, with gaps. What she knew from being there was this. Callum moved, and he moved in a way that was nothing like the careful, measured economy of his ordinary movement. It was controlled, and it was precise, and it was over before she fully understood it had begun. The first man went down with the kind of finality that meant he wouldn't be getting up quickly. The second man was larger and had faster reflexes than his companion, and there was a moment, she saw it, she would not forget it, where it was not clean, where Callum took something across his left forearm and made a sound that was short and involuntary, the sound of someone absorbing pain without stopping. He didn't stop. 20 seconds, maybe less. The second man was on the ground. Callum was breathing harder than usual. He turned to her immediately. "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at his arm. "You are." "It's manageable." He was already pulling his phone. "We need to move to B1 and I need to make a call." He looked at her with the straight-on attention that had been there from the first day in her sitting room. "Can you walk fast?" "I can run," she said. "Walking is fine." She fell into step beside him. Not behind him. She registered that he'd moved to her left rather than ahead of her, adjusting for the arm. And they went toward the stairwell, and he made the call while they moved, 2 words to whoever was on the other end. Now, B1. His former colleague met them at the B1 stairwell door 40 seconds later, came through it at a controlled jog, scanned them both, and said to Callum, with the terse familiarity of someone who had read situations like this before, "How bad?" "Forearm, not deep." Callum looked at Sabrina. "I need you to call Diane Cho." She was already dialing. A chat. The rest of it was not clean because nothing in real situations is clean. It was controlled chaos, police, then building security, arriving to find a situation already contained, then Sabrina's legal team, then 2 board members she trusted calling in quick succession because word had reached them through channels she didn't fully trace until afterward. Marcus Hale resigned by 6 that evening, in a document submitted through his personal lawyer that was precise and preemptive and confirmed nothing directly. It didn't need to. Diane's documentation did that work. By 8 o'clock that evening, the information had been formally transmitted to the appropriate regulatory and law enforcement bodies, and the men from the parking structure were in custody, and 3 separate conversations with board members had been completed, and Sabrina had changed out of her work clothes in her office and was sitting on her couch with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and her hands wrapped around it because they needed something to hold. Callum's arm had been seen by a doctor. An old friend of his former colleagues called in without going through any system that Marcus might still have eyes on, and was bandaged and described as exactly what he'd said, manageable. He'd come to find her once it was done, knocked on the office door, and when she said come in, he'd stood in the doorway looking like someone who had put everything back where it belonged and was now waiting to see if anything else was needed. "Sit down," she said. He came in and sat in the chair across from her couch. "Your arm," she said. "I've had worse." "That's not comforting." "No," he agreed. "There are 2. He nodded. He didn't offer anything to fill the quiet, which was something she had come to value about him more than she could easily explain. "The things you did today," she said, after a moment. "In the garage?" He waited. "You were protecting me," she said. "I know that was the job. I know that's why you were there." "Yes," he said. "But the men on the ground." She looked at him. "You made it a choice about how to handle that. You could have pulled me back toward the main entrance and called it in and waited." "They would have followed," he said. "Probably," she said, "but that's not why you didn't do that." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality than usual. Still level, but with something underneath it that wasn't the professional steadiness she'd become accustomed to. "No, it's not." She looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything more about it, because the thing that needed saying had been said in the parking structure when he'd turned to her with a bruised arm and asked if she was hurt before doing anything else. And it didn't need additional words to mean what it meant. "I want to go home," she said. "I'll get the car," he said. She called Rosa from the elevator, and Rosa put the phone on speaker, and she could hear Maisie's voice in the background asking something about whether her mother was okay, and Rosa saying, yes, she's fine, she's coming home, and Maisie's voice very clearly saying, "Tell her Callum better be with her." Sabrina closed her eyes for just a moment. "He is," she said, loud enough for Maisie to hear. "He's right here." The car was waiting when she came out. Callum was in the driver's seat, his right arm on the wheel, his left resting in his lap with a careful stillness. He glanced at her when she got in, and then back at the road, and he drove. And she watched the city give way to residential streets, and then to the neighborhood she'd chosen carefully years ago for its quiet and its good schools, and its distance from the parts of her world that were always asking something of her. The house was lit up when they pulled in, every downstairs light on, which Rosa did when she was nervous. Maisie appeared at the front door before the car had fully stopped. She was in her pajamas, and her stomachache appeared to have resolved itself, and she stood in the light from the hallway watching the car with an expression that Sabrina recognized as the particular held breath quality of a child who has been managing worry alone for too long. Sabrina got out, and Maisie came down the steps and into her arms without speaking. They stood there on the front path in the cold November evening, and after a moment, Maisie pulled back enough to look past her mother at Callum, who had come around the car and was standing a few feet back with his hands in his pockets and his jacket sleeve covering the bandage on his arm. "You're not hurt?" Maisie said. It was directed at him. "I'm fine," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the precise evaluating attention she gave to things she wasn't sure she believed. Then she looked at his left arm. "That's the arm you use for the bad folds," she said. "On the cranes." "It is," he said. "You should rest it." "I intend to." Maisie turned back to her mother and took her hand and pulled her toward the door, the way she'd been doing since she was old enough to walk, and had decided that her mother's direction sometimes needed assistance. "Noah called," Maisie said, as they went up the steps. "He wants to know if we're still doing Saturday." Sabrina looked back at Callum, who had followed them up the steps and was standing at the threshold with the expression of a man who had spent a very long day managing an enormous amount, and was now standing in the light of a house that was warm and occupied and asking nothing dangerous of him. "Are we still doing Saturday?" Sabrina asked him. He looked at her, and then at Maisie, and something in his face settled into a quietness that was different from his professional stillness, something that came from a different place and was not about being on guard. "Yes," he said, "we're doing Saturday." Maisie nodded, satisfied, and pulled her mother inside. Callum stood in the doorway one more moment, looking back at the quiet street, the ordinary neighborhood, the dark and unremarkable evening that held none of the weight of what the day had been. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The days after the parking structure had a strange underwater quality, everything moving slightly slower than normal, slightly more carefully, as if the world had decided to give them room to catch their breath before asking anything new of them. Sabrina went back to work on Thursday. This was not because she felt ready, exactly, but because staying home felt like a form of losing, and she had spent 15 years making sure that the things that frightened her did not also get to change her habits. She went in with a temporary head of security, a woman named Priya Anand from an outside firm who Diane had vetted personally, and she sat in meetings and reviewed contracts and answered questions from board members who were trying to understand the full shape of what Marcus had done without fully understanding that Sabrina was still assembling that shape herself. The propulsion contract came through 6 days later. They won it. Sabrina found out from her EA at 4 in the afternoon and sat with the news for about 3 minutes before her next meeting started. 6 years of work. 42 engineers and a materials team who had redesigned the thrust vectoring system from scratch in 18 months. A contract that would keep the company solvent through the next market cycle with room to expand. She'd spent 2 years fighting for this from a position of calculated strength, and Marcus had spent the same 2 years trying to erode that position from the inside, and here it was. The outcome he'd been trying to prevent, delivered on a Thursday afternoon while he was waiting for his lawyer to negotiate the terms of his cooperation agreement with federal investigators. She called Callum from her office and said, "We got the contract." A pause. "Congratulations." "Thank you." She looked out the window at the city. "I wanted you to know." "I'm glad," he said, and he meant it. She could tell the difference now between the things he said because they were appropriate and the things he said because they were true. "How's the arm?" "Better. The kids have been very attentive." "What does that mean?" Maisie made a list of foods that promote healing. Noah found a YouTube video about the circulatory system and has been citing it at meals. A brief pause in which she could almost hear him deciding how to characterize this. "It's been educational." She laughed, a real one, short and surprised. "I'll be home by 6. I'll tell Rosa." She hung up and turned back to her desk and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the residual tension and the complicated grief of discovering that someone she'd trusted for 14 years had been lying for a significant portion of that time, something that was clear and unmistakable and warm. She had not felt this uncomplicated about anything in a long while about the question of Marcus and what he had actually been, who he had been, over 14 years, was something Sabrina came back to in the weeks that followed, not obsessively, but with the persistent attention she gave to problems she hadn't fully resolved. She had trusted him completely, and the trust had been wrong, and she was trying to understand how much of what she'd believed about her own judgment to revise as a result. She talked to Callum about it one evening in late November, which surprised her. Not that she talked to him, because they had developed the habit of evening conversations that she'd stopped categorizing as professional debriefs sometime around week 6, but that she talked to him about this specifically, about the personal failure of it, not the organizational one. They were in the kitchen after the kids were in bed, which was when these conversations tended to happen. Maisie and Noah had stayed up until 9 because it was a Friday, and both had lobbied for the extension with the practiced teamwork of children who had figured out their combined petition was harder to refuse than their individual ones. Now the house was quiet, and Sabrina was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine. She was mostly not drinking, and Callum was at the counter eating leftover rice from a container because he ate the way men who'd spent years on irregular schedules ate, whenever the food was available, without much ceremony. "I keep going back to the interviews," she said. "When I hired him, 14 years ago, trying to figure out what I missed." He looked at her. "What did you miss?" "That's what I can't find." She turned the glass slowly. "He was good at his job for a long time. He may have been completely legitimate for the first 10 years. The Stratford relationship goes back 4 years. Diane was very specific about that, which means for a decade he was exactly what I thought he was." "People change," Callum said. "Circumstances change." "That's not very satisfying." "No, but it's usually what's true." He leaned against the counter and ate his rice and thought about this with the directness he brought to things. "You want it to have been there from the beginning. A flaw you should have seen. Something that would make the failure yours instead of just something that happened." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what I'm doing?" "I think so, and I think it's the wrong frame." He set the container down. "You ran a background check that found nothing because there was nothing to find. You hired someone who spent a decade performing the job well. At year 10 or 11, external pressure changed his calculation and he made a different choice. That's not a failure of your judgment in year 1. It's a failure of his character in year 10. He paused. "You can't vet someone's future decisions. You can only respond to them when they show themselves." She looked at him for a long moment. "When did you get philosophical?" "I've always been philosophical," he said, with the absolute absence of humor that was, she had learned, his specific way of being funny. "You weren't paying attention." She picked up her wine and actually drank some of it. "Noah told Maisie that you used to take him to the museum every month, that it was a thing you did." He looked at her, registering the shift. "Yeah." "How long have you been doing that?" "Since he was about 5. Nora—" He stopped, started again. "My wife liked museums. She thought they were the best way to teach kids that the world was bigger than whatever room they were in." He picked up the rice container again, and then didn't eat any of it. "After she died, I didn't take him for almost a year. Then one day, I just took him. It felt like the right thing to keep doing." Sabrina nodded slowly. She waited, because she'd learned that he shared things in his own time, and that pressing in any way was the wrong approach. "The day at the museum," he said, "with Maisie. I didn't know who she was. I just saw a little girl by herself who was scared, and—" He set the container down again. "She reminded me of Noah, the way she was trying not to keep crying, holding it in because she didn't want to make it worse." He looked at the counter. "He did that for a year after Nora, tried to be fine so I wouldn't worry. He was 5. Sabrina pressed her lips together. "Kids shouldn't have to do that," he said. It wasn't a profound statement the way he said it. It was just a fact, delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had been on the other side of it. "No," she said, "they shouldn't." He looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was warm and the house was quiet, and what was between them in that moment was something neither of them moved toward or away from, just let sit there, like something that had been in the room for a while and was no longer pretending not to be. "Tell me about her," Sabrina said. "If you want to." He was quiet for a beat. "Nora?" "Only if you want to." He thought about this. She could see him thinking about it, weighing something. "She was funny," he said, finally. "That's the thing people always forget to say. People say kind, or patient, or good. She was those things, but she was also genuinely funny. She had this... He paused, finding it. She had this way of saying the exact wrong thing at the exact right moment, always with a completely straight face. Drove me insane, and I loved it. What kind of wrong thing? We had this dinner once with my commanding officer and his wife. Very formal. Nora had been sick all week, she was running on no sleep, and at some point during the main course, my CO's wife asked her what she thought about the situation in, I don't even remember where, some geopolitical thing that was in the news. And Nora looked at her very seriously and said, honestly, I've been so focused on whether my husband left the car registration anywhere findable that I haven't been following it. Sabrina put her hand over her mouth. Dead silence, Callum said. And then my CO started laughing first, which was not something he did at dinners, and then it was fine. But for about 4 seconds I was convinced my career was over. A corner of his mouth moved. She apologized afterward. She said she was just too tired to perform. I like her, Sabrina said. Yeah, he said quietly. Most people did. She watched him. He wasn't sad in a broken way. She'd noticed this before, that his grief had the quality of something he'd had years to make room for, that lived alongside him rather than inside him. Not healed exactly, because she wasn't sure that was a thing that happened completely, but carried differently than a wound that was still fresh. Noah has her timing, he said. The dry thing. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to be someone people underestimate in rooms and then walk away from slightly unsettled. Maisie will love that about him, Sabrina said. They're going to be catastrophic together, he agreed. She laughed again, and he almost smiled, and outside the November wind had picked up against the kitchen windows, and neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to move. The question of what they were to each other, what this household had become, what was growing in the spaces between the professional arrangement they'd started with, was not a question either of them asked directly. This was partly temperament. They were both people who had learned, through necessity, to be cautious about things they wanted, to move toward them slowly enough that the ground could be tested before weight was put on it. And it was partly the situation, which had specific and complicated layers that didn't resolve just because the immediate threat had been removed. He was still, technically, her head of security. She was still, technically, his employer. These technicalities became slightly absurd around week 9, when Maisie announced at dinner that Callum had fixed the dishwasher, the grinding noise from the second cycle, which had been going on since before he'd arrived. And Sabrina had looked at him and said, "When did you do that?" And he'd said, "Tuesday. I had 40 minutes. And Maisie had said with great authority, he also recaulked the upstairs bathroom because it was growing mold behind the fixture. And Noah had nodded in the confirming way of someone who had been present for this. And Sabrina had looked at Callum and said, "That's not in your job description." And he'd said, "No, it needed doing." And that had been the entire conversation. She thought about that exchange a lot in the following days. Not because it was significant in itself, but because of what it represented. A man who fixed things that needed fixing without making a point of it, without cataloging it as evidence of his value, without expecting anything back. She had been surrounded for most of her adult life by people who were very aware of their own contributions and wanted her to be equally aware. The alternative was disorienting in a way she hadn't expected. Her ex-husband, Daniel, had been handsome and ambitious and had understood the financial logic of their marriage, an aerospace heiress with more drive than he'd initially credited, but had not understood, or perhaps had not wanted to understand, the actual weight of what she was building. He'd left when Maisie was 3, with the language of incompatibility and personal growth that people used when the real language was too honest to say in front of lawyers. He saw Maisie 4 times a year, precisely, on the dates his attorney had negotiated, and brought gifts that were expensive and exactly wrong, chosen by someone who didn't know her daughter and hadn't invested the attention required to learn. She wasn't angry about this anymore. She had been, for a long time, in the specific sustained way of someone who has been left holding everything and is exhausted by it. But anger had given way, slowly, to something more functional. A clear-eyed assessment of what she had and what she didn't, and what she actually needed, which turned out to be very different from what she'd thought she needed when she was 26, and building a company and a marriage at the same time, and believing that enough competence in enough areas would add up to a life that made sense. What she actually needed, she was beginning to understand, was considerably less complicated than that. It was a warm kitchen and a working dishwasher, and someone who fixed the mold behind the bathroom fixture on a Tuesday because it needed doing. It was the sound of four people crowded around one table arguing about whether the octopus or the mantis shrimp had the more interesting sensory system. It was knowing that when she came home the lights would be on. Boy. December arrived with the particular acceleration that December always had, the calendar filling up with obligations that were partly professional and partly social and entirely exhausting in aggregate. Sabrina navigated it with the controlled efficiency she brought to everything, but she was more aware than usual of the moments that didn't require efficiency. The mornings when she came downstairs and Callum was already there, and they drank coffee and talked about nothing in particular for 15 minutes before the house woke up. The evenings when the four of them ended up in the living room with some film the children had negotiated for, and everyone gradually stopped watching because the conversation was more interesting than the movie. Noah stayed over for the first time in the second week of December, which happened the way most things in this household happened, gradually and then all at once, with a logic that felt inevitable only in retrospect. He and Maisie had a school project due the following Monday that required collaboration, and by 8 o'clock it was apparent that they were nowhere near done and that separating them would produce a worse outcome than finishing. And Rosa had already made up the guest room, and Callum had looked at Sabrina and said, "If that's all right," and she'd said, "The room's already made up." And that had been that. At 9:30, Sabrina went upstairs to check on the project and found them both asleep at the desk. Maisie with her head on her arms across the reference books, Noah in the chair with his head tipped back against the wall, his mouth slightly open, a half-folded paper airplane in one hand. The project was about 70% complete. The remaining 30%, apparently, could wait. She turned off the overhead light and left the desk lamp on, and went quietly back out. And in the hallway, she found Callum standing with his arms crossed, and an expression she had only recently learned to read correctly. Not the professional stillness, but the other thing, the quieter thing that came from somewhere personal. "They fell asleep," she said softly. "I figured." He looked toward the door. "I'll check if Noah needs anything." "I already covered him," she had with the blanket from the foot of the bed, without really thinking about it. "He's fine." Callum looked at her. "Old habit," she said. "I've been doing it since Maisie was born, checking on sleeping children and adjusting blankets for no reason." "It's a good habit," he said. They stood in the hallway outside the door for a moment, both of them quiet. The house settled around them in the particular way of houses where everyone is finally asleep. Downstairs a clock ticked. The heating system made its small sounds. Nothing was required of either of them right now, which was a rarer condition than either would have liked. "I've been thinking about something," Sabrina said. He waited. "The program," she said, "the restructuring of the security division. I've been talking to the company's legal team about establishing something more formal, a transition support program for former military personnel moving into civilian security roles. Single parents, specifically." She paused. "I keep thinking about what you told me, about why you left, that you didn't want to be a father. Noah knew through phone calls." "Yeah," he said carefully. "There are a lot of people who made the same choice and came home and found that civilian life didn't have infrastructure for what they know how to do, not at the level they're capable of." She looked at him. "I want to build something real, not a PR gesture, and I want someone to run it who understands both sides, the military background and the parenting calculation." He was very still. "That's not a job offer yet," she said quickly. "It's nowhere near being a concrete thing. I'm still in the early stages of figuring out whether the structure makes sense, but I wanted to—" She stopped. "I wanted you to know I was thinking about it, because it came from thinking about you, about your situation, about Noah." He looked at her for a moment. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because it felt dishonest not to." She was direct about this. "You've been honest with me since the day you walked in. It seemed like the minimum I owed you." He nodded slowly. He looked at the floor, then back up at her. "If it becomes concrete," he said, "I'd like to hear about it." "I thought you might." A beat. Then, with the specificity that she had come to understand was how he showed things he wasn't going to say outright. "I'd need Noah to stay in his current school. It's been good for him. I don't want to disrupt that." "The program would be based here," she said. "No relocation." He exhaled, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. "Okay." "Okay," she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. The clock downstairs ticked. Something in the room behind them, one of the children, impossible to tell which, shifted and resettled in sleep. "I should let you get to bed," he said. "Probably," she agreed, but neither of them left immediately, and in the hallway light she looked at him and thought about the parking structure, about him turning to her with a bandaged arm asking if she was hurt, about him sitting at a table 10 feet from her crying daughter and folding paper because it was the thing that would actually help, rather than the thing that looked like helping. She had spent years learning to tell the difference between those two things. She had mostly stopped believing she would ever find someone who didn't require the lesson. "Good night, Callum," she said. "Good night," he said. She went to her room. He went down the hall to the small study where he'd taken to sitting in the evenings when the rest of the house was asleep. And if he sat there longer than usual tonight with the lights on and the book he'd been reading unopened in his hands, that was not something anyone saw. Christmas that year was not what Sabrina had planned, which meant it was better than she'd expected. She'd planned a quiet week, a few select invitations, Maisie's school concert, a dinner for the household staff on the 23rd. What actually happened was that Noah's school concert was on the same evening as Maisie's, different venues, and the solution they arrived at, 2 cars, split coverage, everyone attending both, had somehow resulted in a full week of overlapping plans and shared meals and the gradual, unannounced accumulation of small traditions. On the 22nd, they drove 40 minutes outside the city to a tree farm because Maisie had learned from somewhere that cutting your own tree was an experience and had campaigned for it with the sustained focus she brought to causes she believed in. The farm was cold and crowded, and the trees were mostly picked over by the time they got there. And Noah's boots were not waterproof, and his socks were soaked through within 20 minutes. And Maisie chose a tree that was slightly too tall for the living room ceiling and refused to reconsider. And Callum cut it down with the focused economy of someone who had performed more demanding physical tasks than this, and found it somewhat straightforward. And by the time they got it back to the house, everyone was cold and tired, and Noah had developed a specific philosophical position about the relative merits of artificial trees, which he delivered in a wet-socked, intermittent monologue for most of the drive home. It was not a smooth or elegant afternoon. In the living room, trying to fit a tree that was 6 inches too tall into a stand that kept slipping on the hardwood floor, while Maisie directed from the couch with the confidence of someone who had never done this before but had clear opinions about how it should be done, Sabrina looked around at the specific chaos of it. Callum on his knees under the tree trying to level the stand, Noah now in dry socks but still elaborating his artificial tree position to Rosa, who was being patient about it, Maisie on her feet now despite the direction to stay seated because something about the left side of the tree required her physical presence. And she felt something that she hadn't felt in this house for a very long time. It felt lived in, not maintained, not managed. Lived in, the way houses are supposed to feel, with the evidence of people actually occupying the space rather than moving carefully through it. "It's crooked," Maisie announced. "I know," Callum said from under the tree. "Give me a minute. The left side is higher. I know. If you turn the base counterclockwise, Maisie," his voice muffled by branches. "What?" "Give me a minute." She gave him 30 seconds. Then, "Is it better?" A pause. Then he came out from under the tree, pine needles in his hair, and stood back and looked at it. "It's about as straight as it's going to get." Maisie tilted her head. "It leans a little to the right." "Yes." "Is that okay?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who had drawn a line and was prepared to defend it. "Yes, that's okay." She considered this. "I think it has character," she said, in the tone of someone who has decided to adopt the outcome as intentional. "It does," Sabrina said, coming to stand beside her daughter and looking at the imperfect, slightly too tall, mildly lopsided tree that was somehow exactly right. "It absolutely has character." Noah looked up from his conversation with Rosa. "I still think artificial is more practical." "Noted," Callum said. "I'm just saying for next year." "Noah." "What?" "The tree is fine." Noah made the face of someone who has not been convinced but understands the conversation is over, and went back to telling Rosa about the load-bearing advantages of PVC construction. January arrived, and with it the particular quality of January mornings where everyone in the house was slightly depleted from December and slightly unwilling to admit it. School resumed, work resumed, The pace returned, and with the pace came the moments of friction that the holiday's generous calendar had smoothed over. Schedule conflicts, Maisie's school pickup changing 3 times in 1 week, Callum and Sabrina disagreeing about the new security firm's protocols, neither of them entirely wrong, neither of them entirely comfortable being challenged by someone whose judgment they respected. "You're doing it again," Callum said one morning in the hallway when she'd overridden a coverage decision he'd made without telling him she was going to. "I own the company," she said. "You do," he said evenly. "And when it's a company decision, I'll defer to you. When it's a security decision, I need you to at least tell me before you change the plan." She looked at him. He looked back. This was the thing about people who were both accustomed to being right. They needed different things from each other than from people who weren't, and working out what those things were took longer than either of them wanted it to. "I didn't think it required consultation," she said, with slightly less certainty than she'd had 30 seconds ago. "It did," he said, simply, without accusation. She exhaled. "All right. Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank me. I'm going to be bad at this sometimes." "I know." And there was something in the way he said it. Not resignation, not condescension, but the genuine, settled knowledge of someone who had already accounted for this and decided it didn't change anything. That was more disarming than any reassurance would have been. She went to her office. She sat down. She reviewed the contract she'd meant to review an hour ago and kept reading the same paragraph because she was thinking about the hallway. About the way he said "I know" in a way that sounded like it covered a lot of ground. It was Maisie who named the thing first, which was typical. Maisie had always been more willing to say the actual thing than the people around her, possibly because she was 7 and hadn't yet learned the particular adult skill of talking around what you meant. It was a Saturday in late January. Noah was there. They'd all been at the Botanical Conservatory again, a repeat of the first Saturday, now apparently a standing plan, and they'd come home for dinner, and Rosa had made something that required more dishes than the kitchen usually saw in a week, and all 4 of them were crowded around the table eating and talking about whether a Venus flytrap could theoretically eat something as large as a hamster, which Noah had framed as a research question and which Maisie was addressing with scientific seriousness. "It couldn't," Maisie said. "The trap isn't large enough and it doesn't have the digestive capacity." "But hypothetically," Noah said. "Hypothetically is still bound by physical constraints, Noah." "You don't know that." "I literally just explained." "Okay," Callum said. "The hamster is fine. Move on." Maisie pointed her fork at Noah with the authority of someone who has been conceded the point by a third party. Noah ate his food with dignity. The conversation moved, the way dinner conversations did, through several topics before landing on something Maisie's teacher had said about family structures. The school was doing a unit on what families looked like, a modern and deliberately inclusive curriculum that Sabrina had actually reviewed before enrollment and approved. "Mrs. Petrakis says families are whoever you live with and take care of," Maisie said, "and whoever takes care of you." "That's a good definition," Sabrina said. "I think so too." Maisie ate a piece of broccoli with the mechanical focus of someone fulfilling a vegetable obligation. "So we're kind of like a family." The table was quiet for exactly 1 beat. "Because you live here and you take care of us," Maisie continued, looking at Callum with the straightforward directness she brought to factual statements. "And we kind of take care of you too, me and Mom, and Noah comes here a lot." She looked at Noah. "You're basically here all the time." "I'm not here all the time," Noah said. "You were here 4 Saturdays in a row." "That's not all the time." "It's pretty close." Sabrina looked at Callum across the table. He was looking at his plate with an expression that was carefully neutral in the specific way of someone managing something that wanted to be more than neutral. "I think Maisie has a point," Sabrina said, and she said it lightly, in the tone of someone agreeing with a factual observation, because that was what it was. An observation, not a question, not a demand, just a 7-year-old naming the thing that was already true. Callum looked up at her. She looked back. "Noah," Maisie said, "if your dad and my mom got married, would that make you my brother?" "Maisie," Sabrina said, "I'm just asking what the word would be." "Stepbrother," Noah said, with the decisive authority of someone who has looked this up. He paused. "Or just brother, depending on what people want to call it." Maisie nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd been working out. "I'd call it brother," she said. Me too, Noah said. Sabrina looked at her daughter, this 7-year-old person who had spent 2 years pressing herself against walls in the presence of strangers and who was now sitting at a crowded kitchen table discussing family nomenclature with the ease of someone who had always lived this way. She looked at Callum, who was looking at his son with an expression she recognized because she had her own version of it. The specific helplessness of a parent watching a child be braver and clearer about things than the adults around them. We should probably let the adults have some conversations first, Sabrina said carefully to Maisie. Before we get to the words part. Maisie appeared to find this reasonable. Okay. She ate another piece of broccoli. But not too many conversations. Adults take forever. Noah nodded in sincere agreement. Callum finally looked at Sabrina, and something moved across his face that she hadn't seen before, or had seen in pieces, in small amounts, in the parking structure, and the hallway, and the evenings in the kitchen when the house was quiet, but not like this. Not this directly. Not in full daylight, with the dinner dishes still on the table and both children watching with the patient attention of people who have already decided how they'd like this to turn out. She's not wrong, he said, about the adults taking forever. Sabrina held his gaze. No, she said. She's usually not. The table went back to dinner. Noah finished his broccoli without being asked, which Rosa noticed and acknowledged with a small, quiet nod in his direction. Maisie began a new inquiry into whether seagrass qualified as a plant or something else. The kitchen was warm and slightly overcrowded and smelled like the meal they'd just eaten, and outside the January dark had come down early the way it did in winter, and the windows held the light in, and the room was full and imperfect and entirely, unmistakably alive. Under the table, Sabrina felt the side of Callum's hand brush the side of hers. Not quite a hold, not quite accidental. He didn't move away. She didn't either. Outside, the winter dark pressed against the glass. Inside, the light held. The hand thing didn't become anything immediately, because neither of them was built for immediately. That was the truth of it, and Sabrina understood it without needing it explained. They were both people who had been burned by moving faster than the ground could hold. She by a marriage built on ambition and mutual misreading, he by a grief that had arrived without warning and rearranged everything he'd assumed about the future. Caution wasn't cowardice in either of them. It was the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned at some cost that the things worth having were the ones that could bear the weight of being examined slowly. So February came and went with the hand thing sitting quietly between them, like something that had been acknowledged without being named, and they continued the way they'd been continuing. The morning coffee, the evening conversations, the crowded Saturdays, the small domestic frictions that required negotiation, and the negotiations that had started to feel less like conflict and more like two people learning the specific grammar of each other. In March, Sabrina finalized the structure of the transition program with her legal and HR teams. She called it the Reeve model internally, which she did not tell Callum, partly because it would embarrass him, and partly because the name was premature and she knew it. Formally, it was the Westcott Veterans Family Initiative, a program providing placement, mentorship, and wage support for former military personnel with dependents transitioning into private security and risk management roles. 6 initial positions, fully funded, with a 5-year commitment from the company's foundation arm. She presented it to the board in the 3rd week of March, 2 days before she told Callum it existed in its final form. The board approved it in 11 minutes, which was the fastest they had ever approved anything in Sabrina's tenure as CEO. A fact that she suspected had something to do with the parking structure incident and the contract win and the general understanding that Sabrina Westcott's judgment had recently been tested under conditions that removed all ambiguity about its quality. She told Callum on a Wednesday evening. They were in the kitchen. They were always in the kitchen for the conversations that mattered, which she'd noticed and which she thought said something about kitchens and what they were actually for. She walked him through the structure, the funding, the scope, the timeline. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You built this," he said. "The team built it. I directed it." "Sabrina." He said her name the way he said things he wanted her to actually hear. "You built this." She looked at him. "I had good material to work from." He looked at the table, then back at her. "When would it start?" "September, which gives us time to hire the other 5 positions, set up the intake process, And if you want the director role, transition you out of the household detail in a way that doesn't leave a gap. He was quiet again, longer this time. Noah stays in his school, she said. The office is 12 minutes from here. The role pays 30% more than what you're making now, with benefits that include dependent coverage and educational support. She paused. I'm not trying to buy your answer. I'm trying to make sure the answer can be yes if you want it to be. He looked at her steadily. Why does it matter to you? Whether the answer can be yes. It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. Because you gave up a career trajectory that would have made you financially independent for the rest of your life. Because you didn't want to be a father. Noah knew through photographs. And you've been doing work since then that's beneath what you're capable of, because the alternative required more absence than you were willing to accept. She held his gaze. You made the right call, and you've been paying for it in ways you don't complain about. I want to offer you something that doesn't ask you to choose. The kitchen was very quiet. He started and stopped. Started again. That's a significant thing to do for someone. You're not someone, she said simply. And then, because they were both people who appreciated precision, you know what I mean. Yeah, he said, I know what you mean. He accepted the role 3 days later by text at 6:47 in the morning, which was before she was fully awake, and the text said, yes, September, thank you. And then, after a pause that she could see in the timestamp gap, for all of it, she read it twice in bed with her coffee getting cold on the nightstand and felt something so clean and uncomplicated that she almost didn't know what to do with it. April was when the thing between them finally moved from where it had been sitting to somewhere it could be called by its actual name, and it happened, characteristically, without drama. It was a Tuesday. Maisie had a school event, a science showcase, where she presented her project on bioluminescence in deep-sea organisms, which she had been preparing for 6 weeks with an intensity that had occasionally required Sabrina to gently suggest that 7 hours of preparation for a 45-minute event might be approaching diminishing returns. Maisie had acknowledged this observation and continued preparing. Noah had asked to come. This had required a conversation about whether Noah attending Maisie's school event was something Maisie wanted, which it turned out she did, very much, and whether Callum was comfortable with the deviation from his usual Tuesday schedule, which he was, and whether Rosa needed the car that evening, which she didn't, so all 4 of them went. The science showcase was in the school gymnasium, which smelled like every school gymnasium in every season, and the presentations were arranged on folding tables in a large square around the perimeter. Maisie's table had a poster she'd made herself. Not entirely straight, the letters slightly uneven, the photographs of anglerfish printed from the school library and slightly blurry, and a small demonstration lamp she'd rigged with Rosa's help to approximate bioluminescent glow, which worked about 60% of the time and failed the other 40 in ways that Maisie had decided gave the presentation a live element. She presented to her classmates and their parents for 22 minutes, which was significantly longer than she'd been allocated, and her teacher had tried twice to signal the time limit, and both times Maisie had absorbed the signal and continued because she had 2 more points to make, and they were important. Sabrina stood at the back of the small crowd around Maisie's table and watched her daughter hold forth about the light-producing organs of the anglerfish, and felt the specific pride of a parent watching a child be unambiguously, completely themselves. She became aware that Callum had moved to stand beside her. She went over time, he said quietly. She always goes over time. Is that a problem? Her teacher gave up trying to stop her in October. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Beside him, Noah was watching Maisie's presentation with the expression of someone who had heard most of this before but was still interested, which Sabrina thought said something genuinely good about his character. When Maisie finished, concluding with a summary statement about the evolutionary advantages of producing your own light in an environment where external light didn't exist, which landed with more weight than she probably intended. There was applause, and she accepted it with the grave composure of someone who had done the work and found the recognition appropriate. She found them at the back of the crowd and came directly to Noah. "Did you see the lamp?" she said. "It worked 4 times. "I counted 5, he said. She looked at him with sharp attention. "Are you sure?" "The 3rd one you said didn't count because it flickered." "It did flicker." "It still produced light." Maisie appeared to genuinely reconsider her count. Okay. 5. Noah looked satisfied. This was, Sabrina had come to understand, the specific economy of their friendship. Maisie was usually right about facts, and Noah was usually the one who caught the things she'd miscounted or miscategorized, and both of them had come to rely on this division of labor with the easy confidence of people who have found someone whose strengths cover their gaps. Afterward, walking to the car in the April evening, Maisie took her mother's hand on the left and Noah's hand on the right, and Noah didn't pull away. And Callum walked on Sabrina's other side, and they crossed the school parking lot 4 across, which required some navigation around other families and at least one minivan, and at some point Sabrina's shoulder bumped Callum's arm and neither of them moved apart. At the car, Maisie looked up at her mother. "That was good," she said, with the assessing finality of someone who had reviewed the evening and found it satisfactory. "It was," Sabrina agreed. "The lamp worked 5 times," Maisie said. "Noah was right." "Noah usually is," Callum said. Noah received this with visible pleasure and climbed into the car. Maisie climbed in after him, and Sabrina was reaching for the door handle when Callum's hand got there first, not hurriedly, just present, holding it open. She looked at him. He looked at her. The parking lot was busy around them, other families moving to their cars, the ordinary noise of an ordinary school evening. "You should have seen her 6 months ago," Sabrina said quietly. "She would have presented to 3 people maximum before she needed to stop." "I know," he said. "That's because of you and Noah." He shook his head slightly. "That's because of her. He paused. "We were there." She looked at him for a moment in the parking lot light, this man with pine needles in his hair and a slightly crooked Christmas tree and a bandaged arm that he'd called manageable, and a son who counted lamp flickers to make sure his friend got credit for all 5. And she thought, there it is, that's the word for it. She didn't say it in the parking lot. The moment wasn't right for the full weight of it, but she held it, and he seemed to know she was holding it, and they got in the car and drove home through the April evening, and that was enough for tonight. He asked her in May. He asked her in the courtyard of the Hargrove Science Museum on a Saturday morning, which was where all of this had begun, where a paper airplane had flown across a fountain to a crying child who had stopped crying, where something had started that neither of them had understood was starting. Sabrina had not known this was coming. She would later insist on this because it was true, and also because she had a personal policy about not pretending to be more composed about things than she actually was. She had not known. She had thought they were at the museum because Noah had a new enthusiasm for the geology exhibit that had opened in March, and Maisie had wanted to revisit the deep-sea display with the technical eye of someone who had now presented on the subject, and it was Saturday, and the museum was where they went. They'd been there for 2 hours. The children were in the deep-sea hall on the other side of the building with Rosa, who had come along because the Saturday outings had expanded in that gradual, accretive way. Sabrina and Callum were in the courtyard. The same courtyard, with the same fountain, with the bronze fish that Maisie had told her about, the one that looked slightly wrong for the species. It was a warm May morning. The fountain was running. There were other people around, families and couples and school groups, the ordinary Saturday crowd. Callum had been quieter than usual for the last hour. She'd noticed, but not pressed. He stopped walking at the edge of the fountain. She stopped beside him. He looked at the fountain for a moment and then at her. "This is where it started," he said. "I know," she said. "Maisie told me about the fountain, which fish it was." "The bass." She said it looked like someone had described a bass over the phone, and the sculptor had never actually seen one. Sabrina almost smiled. She's not wrong. She's usually not. He looked at the fountain again. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and she could see from the angle that one hand was closed around something. She noticed and didn't say anything. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't..." He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at this part. The words part. Callum. I know what I want to say. He exhaled. "I spent 3 years after Nora telling myself that the reason I wasn't moving toward anything was Noah, that I was protecting him, and that was partly true." He looked at her now. "But it was also that I was scared, and I hadn't been scared of much in a long time. The things I used to be scared of were things I'd trained for. He stopped again. She waited. "I don't have training for this," he said. "I have a 7-year-old who told me 2 months ago that I take too long and I should just ask you." Sabrina put her hand over her mouth. "She's not wrong," he said. "No," Sabrina managed. "She's usually not." He took his hand out of his pocket. In it was a ring. Simple, a single stone, nothing ostentatious, the kind of ring chosen by someone who knew the person it was for and knew she didn't need things to be large to be significant. He held it the way he held most things, steadily, without performance. "I know this is fast," he said. "It's been 14 months, she said. "I know, Callum." She said his name and he stopped. "Ask me." He looked at her. "Sabrina, will you marry me?" It wasn't quite a question the way he said it. It had the quality of something he'd already thought through from every angle and arrived at as the correct conclusion. Which was, she thought, exactly how he would ask. She opened her mouth to answer, from behind her, clearly and without hesitation, at a volume that reached at least half the courtyard. "Yes!" She turned around. Maisie was standing 15 feet away with Noah beside her, both of them having apparently abandoned the deep-sea exhibit, and Rosa at some point in the last few minutes, and Maisie's face had the expression of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment and was not sorry to have arrived in time for it. "Maisie," Sabrina said. "Sorry," Maisie said, in a tone that was not remotely sorry. Noah beside her was trying to contain an expression that he was not successfully containing. Sabrina looked at her daughter, then at Noah, then at Callum, who was looking at his son with the expression of a man who had attempted a plan and was reviewing where the plan had deviated from the expected course. "How long have you two known?" Sabrina asked. "Noah found the ring 2 weeks ago," Maisie said. "I didn't find it," Noah said. "It was in a jacket pocket, and I was hanging up the jacket." "You found it," Maisie said. "He told you," Sabrina said. "Immediately," Noah confirmed, without guilt. Callum pinched the bridge of his nose. Sabrina looked at him. He looked at her, and she thought about all of it. The parking lot, and the kitchen, and the pine needles, and the bandaged arm, and the lopsided Christmas tree, and the 5 lamp flickers and a paper airplane with uneven wings that flew really far. And she thought about her daughter at 7 years old pressing her lips to her ear and saying, "I know him, and I really like him." And she thought about how much had been asked of both of them, and how much they had both quietly carried, and how the carrying had not diminished them but had brought them, somehow, here, to a museum courtyard in May, with 2 children who had conspired to be present, and a ring held steadily in an unshaking hand. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." Maisie made a sound that was not a word. Noah said, "I told you she'd say yes immediately." "She took longer than I thought," Maisie said. "You said yes before she could answer." "That's different from her taking long up." "Okay," Callum said, and he put the ring on Sabrina's hand, and both children watched this with the focused attention they gave to things that mattered. And the courtyard of the Hargrove Science Museum went on around them in its ordinary Saturday way, the fountain running and the light coming down warm through the early May sky. They married in September. On the same weekend, the Westcott Veterans Family Initiative opened its doors. This was not a coincidence. Sabrina had aligned the dates deliberately, not for symbolism. She was not, by nature, a symbolic thinker, but because September was when Callum's role as director began, and it seemed right that the 2 things that marked the end of one arrangement and the beginning of another should happen in the same breath. The ceremony was in the back garden of the house. 40 people, immediate family and close friends, and a handful of colleagues whose presence felt earned rather than obligatory. No elaborate production. Rosa had an opinion about the flower arrangements that Sabrina had learned to accept unconditionally. The caterer was a woman from the neighborhood who had once left a card in their mailbox and whose food Maisie had approved after a tasting that she had requested and conducted with professional gravity. Maisie wore a dress she'd chosen herself, which was pale green and slightly too formal for a garden wedding and exactly right for her. She'd objected to the original choice on the grounds that she'd be sitting in it for hours and needed to be able to move, and the compromise had taken 3 weeks and resulted in something that was both appropriate and Maisie, which was the only outcome that was going to work. Noah carried the ring. He was 8 now, had turned 8 in July, at a birthday party that had included a tent in the backyard and more children than Sabrina had originally planned for, and a cake shaped like a paper airplane that had been Maisie's idea and that the baker had executed with unexpected technical precision. I was 8, and he carried the ring with the solemn responsibility of someone who understood the assignment, though he had also, that morning, triple-checked that it was in the box before they left the house, which Callum had witnessed and not commented on, but which had produced, briefly, the look of a father watching his son be more careful than the situation required, and finding that enormously, privately, good. The ceremony was short. The officiant was an old friend of Callum's, a woman named Sandra, who'd worked in civilian family advocacy since leaving service and who had agreed immediately when he called. She had a dry, specific wit and a delivery that made the words feel actual rather than performed, which was what both of them had wanted. They wrote their own vows. This had been Sabrina's suggestion and Callum's reluctant agreement, and neither of them had shown the other what they'd written beforehand. Sabrina went first. She stood in the September garden with the light coming through the leaves. At the angle it came through only in September, when it was still warm but beginning to remember what it would become. And she looked at Callum in his dark jacket with the pine needle-free hair, and she said, "I spent a long time believing that being strong meant not needing anything, that the right version of my life was the one I could manage entirely on my own, without gaps, without dependence, without anyone close enough to see the places where I was tired." She paused. "I was wrong about that. Not about being strong, about what strength actually is." She looked at him steadily. "You never asked me to be less than I am. You asked me to let someone stand next to me. That's different, and it took me a while to understand the difference." Another pause, shorter. "I understand it now. And I'm not going to be good at all of this all the time. I'm going to be difficult and overbooked and occasionally convinced I'm right when I'm not." A small, honest breath. "But I'm going to show up. Every day. For you and for Noah. The way you showed up for me and for Maisie before anyone asked you to." She pressed her lips together. "That's what I've got. It's not a poem, but it's true." 40 people were quiet. Maisie, in the front row, was watching her mother with an expression that was trying very hard to remain composed and was not succeeding, which was the most openly she had cried in public in 2 years, and which she would later refer to as the light bothering her eyes, a claim that no one challenged. Callum looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "I have been careful most of my life," he said, and his voice was level, but only just, the levelness of someone using a skill with full awareness of using it. "Careful in my work, careful with Noah, careful about what I let matter, because I'd learned that the things that matter are the things that can hurt you." He paused. "And then I sat down 10 feet from a crying kid in a museum courtyard, and everything I was being careful about stopped being the point." He looked at her. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what that afternoon was going to become. I just knew that a little girl was scared, and that nobody else had stopped." A beat. "That's how I've always known what the right thing was. Not from planning, from what I couldn't walk past." He stopped for a moment. "You are the thing I couldn't walk past," he said. "You and Maisie. And I'm not going to be easy to live with all the time. I don't talk enough about the things I'm feeling, and I fix things around the house without asking, and I will always, always choose the children first if it comes to that." He looked at her. "But I will not leave. I know how to stay. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life staying." Sandra said the words. They said the words. Noah delivered the ring with both hands in a gravity that made Sandra briefly lose her composure. Maisie, when given the opportunity to voice any objection, said instead loudly and preemptively, "Obviously not." And there was laughter that broke the held breath quality of the afternoon and released it into something warmer. Callum kissed his wife in the September garden while 40 people who had earned the right to be there made the kind of noise people make when something has been a long time coming. That evening, after the guests had gone and the caterer had cleared the garden and Rosa had put the leftover cake in containers with the focused efficiency of someone who understood the sacred importance of good cake, the 4 of them sat on the back steps in the dark. This was not a planned conclusion to the day. It had happened gradually, as things did. Noah had come out first because he'd wanted to look at the stars, a recent interest sparked by a library book. Maisie had followed because she didn't like being the only one inside. Callum had come because the children were outside, and he was constitutionally unable not to know where the children were. Sabrina had come because the kitchen had emptied out, and the step was where everyone was. They sat in a loose arrangement, nobody particularly planned. Maisie leaning against Sabrina, Noah beside Callum with his star chart open in his lap, though it was too dark to read it without a light. "That star," Noah said, pointing at something. "That one's Vega." "How do you know?" Maisie said. "The book. It's one of the brightest in the northern sky." Maisie looked at it. "It doesn't look brighter than the others." "Brightness in astronomy is relative to—" "Noah, what?" "I believe you," Maisie said. "I'm just saying it doesn't look different." Noah appeared to find this a reasonable distinction. "A lot of important things don't look different from the outside," he said, with the slightly accidental profundity of children who haven't yet learned to edit themselves. Nobody said anything for a moment. Above them, the September sky was clear and dense with stars, the kind of sky that the city didn't usually offer, but that appeared occasionally when the weather was right and the light was low. The garden smelled like late summer and the remnants of the afternoon, cut flowers and something sweet from the caterer's dessert table. "Is this what it's always going to be like?" Maisie asked. It was directed at no one specific. "What do you mean?" Sabrina said. "Like this. All four of us." She wasn't asking with anxiety. It was the same clear, factual tone she used for scientific questions, the tone of wanting to understand the actual shape of something. "Is this what a regular Tuesday is going to be like, except with stars?" Callum looked at Sabrina over the top of Maisie's head. She looked back. "Pretty much," Sabrina said. Maisie appeared to process this. "Good," she said. And then she leaned more comfortably against her mother and went back to looking at the stars with the satisfied attention of someone who has confirmed the information they needed. Noah found Vega again and explained to Maisie why it would eventually become the North Star in roughly 12,000 years due to the axial precession of the Earth. And Maisie asked 3 follow-up questions that Noah answered with the patient thoroughness of someone who had found his audience. And above them, the stars did what stars do, which is remain entirely indifferent to human arrangements while being looked at anyway, which is perhaps the most honest thing about them. Sabrina sat in the garden with her husband's shoulder warm against hers and her daughter's weight against her side, and thought about the things she had believed, at various points in her life, about what she was building and what it was for. The company, which was real and significant and had employed thousands of people and would employ thousands more. The walls she'd built carefully around the parts of herself that couldn't afford to be reached. The long, exhausting vigilance of being both the person who earned the money and the person who was the parent, with no one to hand either task to at the end of a hard day. She had built those walls because the alternative had seemed naive, and she had been right about some of it. There were things you couldn't afford to leave unprotected, things that required vigilance precisely because the world didn't organize itself around your vulnerability. But she had been wrong about what the walls were for. You didn't build walls to live inside them. You built them so that the space inside could be safe enough to leave unguarded sometimes. So that inside the walls there could be a kitchen table and a lopsided Christmas tree and a boy counting lamp flickers and a 7-year-old pressing her lips to her mother's ear and saying, "I know him," before any of the adults had caught up. The things worth protecting were the ones inside. And the things inside, it turned out, didn't need to be protected from everything. They needed to be tended, shown up for, fixed when they broke, like a grinding dishwasher, without making a production of the fixing. Needed, sometimes, just 4 people on a back step in September looking at stars that didn't look different from each other, but were. She thought about a photograph she'd found 2 weeks earlier, in the process of reorganizing the house's entryway for the life it was going to contain now. A photo from Maisie's 2nd birthday. Sabrina alone with her, the 2 of them, Daniel already moving toward the door in every sense. Sabrina had looked so determined in that photograph, so certain that determination would be enough. It had been enough to get here. It just wasn't going to be what kept her here. Months later, on a rainy Sunday, when the house was full and loud and everyone was slightly underslept from a late Friday and still recovering, Maisie found an old box of photographs in the study. This was not an unusual thing for Maisie to find. She had a habit of exploring the house's less trafficked spaces with the systematic curiosity of a naturalist, and the study had 3 closets whose contents she had been gradually cataloging since November with Rosa's permission. The box was from the early years of the company. Sabrina's office, a board meeting, a charity event, and, filling most of the back third of the box, photographs from the household security arrangements of the previous 14 months. Maisie sat cross-legged on the study floor and went through them. She knew some of these faces vaguely, the ones who had been here long enough to be a recurring presence before she'd made herself scarce. She didn't know the others, the ones who had lasted days. She looked at each face with the careful attention she gave to things, trying to remember, filing them away. She counted. 9 faces. 9 men, looking varying degrees of formal and professional, standing in the foyer or the driveway, or positioned near the garden gate. She got to the end of the household photos and sat with the stack in her hands. Then she went to the box of more recent photos. Rosa kept them in an adjacent box, organized chronologically, and found what she was looking for about 2/3 of the way through. Callum, in the kitchen, on what looked like one of the first Saturdays, his back partially to the camera, both children at the table with the chessboard between them. She held this photograph for a moment, then she held it next to the stack of 9. She counted through the 9 again, just to be sure. 10. She sat with both stacks in her hands, the 9 and the 1, and looked at them for a while in the gray Sunday light from the study window. Then she put the 9 photographs back in the old box and closed the lid. She kept the 10th. She brought it downstairs to the kitchen, where Sabrina was at the table with her laptop, and Callum was making something on the stove, and Noah was at the counter attempting a paper crane with the focused intensity of someone who had raised his standards since October and now refused to accept anything less than symmetrical folds. Maisie put the photograph on the table beside her mother's laptop. Sabrina looked at it, then at Maisie. "I counted," Maisie said. Sabrina looked at the photograph again. Callum's back, the chessboard, the 2 children, the ordinary Saturday kitchen. "There were 9 before him," Maisie said. "I remember most of them. They were fine." She paused, with the precision of someone being accurate rather than unkind. "But they weren't right." "No," Sabrina said quietly. "They weren't." "He was right," Maisie said. "From the first day." She looked at the photograph. "I just knew." From the stove, Callum glanced over his shoulder at the 2 of them, reading the quality of the conversation without hearing it, the way he'd learned to read most things in this house. "Everything okay?" he said. "Yes," Maisie said. She picked up the photograph and looked at it one more time. Then she took it to the small corkboard near the hallway door where Rosa pinned things, school schedules, grocery lists, appointment reminders, and pinned it there, in the center where it would be seen. Number 10. She stepped back and looked at it. Noah looked up from his crane. "What's that?" "A photograph," Maisie said. "Of what?" "Of us," she said simply. "One of the first ones." Noah looked at it, then at his father, then at Sabrina, then back at the photograph with the expression of someone who had arrived in this family through a side door and was still occasionally surprised, in the best way, to find himself so thoroughly inside it. "We should take a new one," he said. "So there's an after." "We should," Sabrina agreed. Callum turned from the stove, dish towel over one shoulder, and looked at the 4 of them. His son with a half-folded crane, his wife with her hand still resting on the table near where the photograph had been, Maisie standing with her arms loosely crossed, looking at the corkboard with the satisfied expression of someone who has finished a calculation and found it correct. He looked at the photograph on the board. He thought about a museum courtyard and a box of paper squares and a little girl who had been trying very hard not to keep crying. He thought about sitting down 10 feet away because approaching too fast would have been the wrong thing. He thought about all the things he had ever been trained to do, the things that had required precision and speed and the willingness to move through danger without hesitating, and how none of it had mattered as much in the end as knowing when to sit still and fold something small and let the distance close on its own terms. He thought about Nora, the way he always did, not with the sharp-edged grief of the first years, but with the softer, more integrated ache of someone who carries a person with them rather than behind them. She would have found this funny, he thought, all of it, the 9 bodyguards, the false calendar entry, the parking structure, the lopsided tree, the proposal with the 8-year-old ruined surprise assist. She would have sat across from him at a table very much like this one and delivered a deadpan verdict on the entire sequence with her absolute straight face. "You had to almost get beaten up in a parking garage," she would have said, "before you figured it out." He would have said it wasn't like that. She would have looked at him. He would have said, maybe a little like that. And she would have laughed, and that would have been enough, because that was what it was. Enough. Not perfect, never finished, always requiring something. Effort or patience or the willingness to sit down 10 feet away and wait. But enough. After breakfast, he said, "We'll take the new one." Maisie nodded. Noah went back to his crane. Sabrina looked at her husband across the kitchen and thought, here's the thing about love that nobody tells you when you're young and afraid of needing it. It doesn't arrive as rescue. It doesn't come in at the last minute and solve the thing you couldn't solve alone. It arrives the way Callum had arrived, quietly, when the situation called for someone to sit down nearby and fold something small and ordinary and wait, without pressure, for the scared thing to come closer when it was ready. It arrives as patience that doesn't perform itself as patience. It arrives as a man who fixes the dishwasher on a Tuesday because it needed doing. And if you're very lucky and also paying attention, you recognize it before someone has to ruin the surprise by shouting yes. The rain came down outside. The kitchen was warm. On the stove, whatever Callum was making smelled like Saturday mornings, though it was Sunday, which meant the week was allowed to start a little gently for once. Maisie went to help Noah with the crane's final fold, and their two heads bent together over the paper, and the photograph stayed on the board where she'd put it, the 10th and the last, the one that didn't need to be followed by another. Because the 10th hadn't simply been the end of a long, frustrating count. He'd been the beginning of everything after.